Tonight, we're diving into a gentle what-if, a small change to an old story that turns out to change a great deal. The story of a lonely boy on Privet Drive, who, in this telling, was not quite so alone. Imagine that when Hermione Granger was very young, her family moved to Little Whinging, to a neat house only a few doors down from number 4. And that too clever. Solitary children found one another years before any letter ever came. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve and nothing here to fear. Only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters, we will follow them without haste, through secret talks in the gap between two gardens, through a warm library on cold afternoons, through 2 letters that arrived on the same bright morning, and through all the long adventures that came after, faced this time by 2 friends who had been friends almost all their lives. You do not need to remember any of it. Let the story move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you softly down towards sleep. Chapter 1. A New Family on the Street. Little Whinging was the sort of place that prided itself on having nothing at all to remark upon. Its streets ran straight and clean, its hedges were clipped to the same modest height, and its houses stood in tidy rows like teeth that had all been told, very firmly, to behave. Privet Drive sat in the heart of this ordinariness, a curve of pale brick homes with square lawns and square windows and square little cars parked in square little drives. On any given morning, the milk bottles gleamed on the doorsteps, the curtains twitched in a slow and watchful rhythm, and the whole street seemed to hold its breath, waiting to be certain that no one, anywhere, was doing anything unusual. It was a place built for sameness, and it wore that sameness like a starched collar, proud and a little tight at the throat. Into this street, on a soft gray afternoon in early autumn, came a removal van, and a family the neighbors had never seen before. The van was ordinary enough, and the family seemed ordinary too, which was the highest compliment Privet Drive could offer, though it withheld that compliment for several weeks out of habit. The Grangers, they were called. He was a tall, calm man with careful hands, and she was a bright, quick-eyed woman with a warm and practical manner, and both of them were dentists, which the neighbors found reassuringly respectable, for dentists dealt in cleanliness and small corrections, and Privet Drive approved of both. They carried in their boxes without any fuss, nodded politely at the curtains that twitched to observe them, and settled into a neat house a little way along the road, only a few doors from number 4. But it was not the parents who would matter most to this story. It was the child who climbed down from the car after them, a small girl with a great quantity of brown hair that seemed to have ideas of its own, and 2 front teeth that were a fraction too large for her face, and eyes that were older and steadier than a child's eyes usually are. Her name was Hermione, and she stood on the pavement of her new street, clutching a book against her chest as though it were a small, warm animal she was determined not to lose. She looked at the tidy houses, and the clipped hedges, and the square little lawns, and something in her went very quiet, the way a clever child goes quiet when she senses, without quite understanding it, that she has arrived somewhere that will not know what to do with her. The Grangers loved their daughter with a gentle, slightly bewildered devotion. They had wanted a child for a long time, and when Hermione had come to them, she had come already reaching for the world, learning her letters almost before she could walk, asking questions that left grown adults blinking, and filling every quiet corner of the house with books she had read twice over. Her parents had done their best. They had bought her the books she craved and listened, patiently, to the long streams of facts she offered them at breakfast, and they had told her, again and again, that she was a wonderful girl. And she believed them, Mostly. But there is a particular loneliness that comes to a child who is cleverer than the world immediately around her, and no amount of love from good and busy parents can entirely reach it. Hermione carried that loneliness quietly, folded up small inside her, like a letter she had written to a friend she had not yet met. That first evening in the new house, while the boxes stood unopened in the hall, and the smell of fresh paint hung in the air, Hermione sat on the sill of her bedroom window and looked out at Privet Drive. The street lamps had come on one by one, pooling small circles of amber light along the pavement, and the houses had drawn their curtains, and the whole street had settled into its evening silence. She could see number 4 from where she sat, a house like all the others, brightly lit downstairs, with the flicker of a television washing blue across the front room. There seemed to be a great deal of noise and warmth in that house, and yet, though she could not have said why, it did not look to her like a happy place. It looked, she thought, like a house that was very full and very careful, and that was somehow guarding something it did not love. She did not know yet that she was right. She did not know that behind those bright windows a small boy slept in a cupboard beneath the stairs, or that he was, at that very moment, being told by a large and purple-faced man that he was lucky to have any bed at all. She knew nothing of him, nor he of her. But the street had drawn them together onto the same short curve of pavement, and though neither child could have named the reason, the world had a habit of arranging such things long before the children involved understood them. Hermione's days soon settled into a shape. In the mornings her parents drove off together to their practice, kind and distracted, and already discussing the day's appointments, and Hermione was left to her own devices, which suited her better than anyone guessed. She unpacked her books first, before her clothes, before anything, arranging them along the shelves her father had put up, running her fingers down their spines like a musician tuning strings. She read on the stairs and in the garden and beneath the kitchen table. She read walking, which alarmed the neighbors, and she read in the bath until the pages went soft at the corners. Books did not find her strange. Books never once looked at her hair, or her teeth, or the way she raised her hand at questions no one had asked. In books she was simply a mind meeting other minds, and there she was entirely at home. But even the most devoted reader must sometimes lift her eyes from the page, and when Hermione did, she began, slowly, to watch the street. She watched the milk arrive, and the post arrive, and the neighbors go about their small, guarded lives. She watched a fat blonde boy at number 4 ride a shining new bicycle in wobbling circles, shouting for an audience. And once or twice, at the very edge of things, in the narrow gap between the fat boy's shouting and the closing of a door, she caught sight of another child. A thin one, a quiet one. A boy who seemed always to be at the outside of every warmth, carrying things too heavy for him, keeping his eyes down. He was there, and then he was gone, folded back into that bright, careful house, and Hermione, watching from her window with a book forgotten in her lap, felt a small tug of curiosity she did not yet have a word for. She was a child who noticed things. That was, in the end, the truest thing about her, truer than her cleverness or her loneliness or the wildness of her hair. She noticed. And on a street that had trained itself for a lifetime not to notice anything at all, that quiet, stubborn attention would turn out to matter more than anyone on Privet Drive could possibly have imagined. For now, though, she simply watched and read and waited, without knowing what she waited for, while the autumn deepened and the lamps came on a little earlier each evening, and the thin boy at number 4 moved through his careful house like a shadow that no one troubled to see. Up next in Chapter 2, the boy in the cupboard next door will draw closer to that quiet, watchful child and see the strange coldness of number 4 through the tender, and puzzled eyes of the girl who had begun, without meaning to care. Chapter 2. The Boy in the Cupboard Next Door. As the autumn settled over Little Winging and the leaves came down in slow gold spirals along Privet Drive, Hermione Granger began, quietly and without telling anyone, to make a study of the boy at number 4. She did not think of it as spying, for she was a serious child with a serious sense of fairness, and spying was something she disapproved of. She thought of it, rather, as noticing, and she had always noticed things more carefully than other people did. She noticed that the boy was small for his age, smaller than the fat blonde child who shared his house, and thinner too, with a thinness that did not look like the ordinary slightness of childhood, but like something closer to going without. She noticed the glasses he wore, held together at one corner with a great deal of tape, sitting crooked on a face that was pale and watchful and quick. And she noticed his hair, black and untidy, standing up at the back no matter what, as though it had never once in its life agreed to lie flat. But it was not his appearance that held her attention through those lengthening evenings. It was the way the household treated him. Hermione was clever enough and observant enough to read a family the way she read a book, and the family at number 4 told a story that made her uneasy in a way she could not quite put down. There was the large, purple-faced man who came and went in his company car, loud and pleased with himself, who patted the fat boy on the head and never once, that Hermione saw, laid a kind hand on the thin one. There was the woman, all sharp angles and a long neck, who spent a remarkable amount of time watching the street through her front window, and who spoke to the thin boy, when she spoke to him at all, with her mouth pulled tight and small. And there was the fat blonde boy himself, who seemed to have been given everything the house contained, and who used a great deal of it to torment the boy who had been given nothing. Hermione watched all of this from her window, and from the garden, and from the pavement where she walked with a book held open before her, and slowly a picture assembled itself in her mind, and it was not a happy picture. She saw the thin boy sent out to weed the flower beds in the cold, while the fat boy watched cartoons. She saw him carry heavy bags of shopping, while the others walked ahead, empty-handed. She saw him wear clothes that hung off him in great folds, clothes that had plainly belonged first to the larger child, so that he went about looking like a small shadow dressed in someone else's day. And she saw, most of all, the careful way he made himself small, the way he kept to the edges of things, the way he had learned, young, that being noticed in that house was rarely a good thing. It puzzled her, and it troubled her, and both feelings grew. Hermione had been loved. She knew, in the sure and unspoken way that loved children know, that her parents thought her wonderful, even when they were too busy to say so, even when they did not understand a word of what she told them at breakfast. She had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that all children carried that same quiet certainty inside them, that it was simply part of what it meant to be a child. Now, watching the boy at number 4, she began to understand that this was not so, and the understanding sat heavily in her chest. Here was a child, no older than herself, who moved through his own home like a guest who had overstayed, and no one seemed to think it strange at all. She learned his name the way children learn everything about their neighbors, in scraps and overheard fragments. The fat boy shouted it across the garden, usually as an insult, and the sharp-faced woman called it from the door in a voice like a closing drawer. Harry, it was an ordinary name, a small, plain, sturdy name, and it suited the boy far better than his oversized clothes did. Hermione turned it over in her mind. She had not yet spoken to him. She was not, for all her cleverness, a bold child in the ordinary way, and there was a hedge and a fence and a great weight of English politeness between her window and his garden. But she found herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering whether he was warm, wondering whether he had eaten, wondering whether anyone in that bright and careful house had ever once asked him how he was. There was a particular evening she would remember long afterward, though she could not have said, at the time, why it mattered. It was cold, and the light was going, and Hermione had come out to the low wall at the bottom of her garden to finish a chapter before supper. Across the way, at number 4, the front door opened, and the boy was put out onto the step, not cruelly exactly, but firmly, the way one puts out a cat, and the door closed behind him. He stood there for a moment, in the failing light, in his enormous gray jumper, and he did not knock, and he did not cry, and he did not do any of the things a child might be expected to do. He simply sat down on the cold step with his thin arms wrapped around his knees and looked out at the darkening street with an expression of such quiet, practiced patience that something in Hermione's chest folded over and ached. She did not go to him that evening. She was too shy and too uncertain, and it was nearly supper, and there was the hedge and the fence and all the careful distance of the street between them. But she stayed at the wall much longer than her chapter required, sitting very still in the cold, keeping him company across the gap without his ever knowing it, until at last the sharp-faced woman opened the door and let him back inside, and the step was empty, and the lamps had all come on, and Hermione went in to her warm, bright kitchen, to her parents and her supper and her shelf of beloved books, carrying with her a new and uncomfortable knowledge that she did not know what to do with. It was possible, it turned out, to be a child and to be terribly alone. She had felt a version of it herself, the loneliness of being unlike the others. But this was something sharper and colder, and it had a name and a small taped pair of glasses and a jumper 3 sizes too big. That night she lay awake longer than usual, listening to the quiet of the house and the occasional swish of a late car passing down Privet Drive. And she thought about the boy on the step. She did not make any grand resolutions, for she was too sensible and too shy for that. But somewhere beneath the level of resolutions, in the place where a child's truest choices are made, something turned toward him, quietly and for good. She had noticed him, truly noticed him, in the way that changes a person a little for having done it. And once Hermione Granger had truly noticed a thing, she was never, in all her life, quite able to unnotice it again, nor able to stop herself from wanting, quietly and stubbornly, to make it better. Up next, in Chapter 3, 2 Lonely Children and a Hedge, will follow the small, brave steps by which 2 solitary children found one another in the gap between 2 gardens and discovered, with wonder, that neither of them was quite so alone as they had believed. Chapter 3, 2 Lonely Children and a Hedge. Between the garden of the Granger's house and the run of gardens along Privet Drive there ran a hedge, an old privet hedge, thick and green and rather overgrown at one end where the tidy hands of the neighbors had never quite reached. It was from this hedge that the street took its name, though few of the residents remembered as much, and it was in the shelter of this hedge, in a gap where the branches had grown apart to make a kind of green and secret room, that the friendship began. Neither child planned it. Friendships between shy children are almost never planned. They happen the way water finds its way downhill, slowly, by small, inevitable steps, until one day the thing is simply there, and both children wonder how they ever lived without it. It began, as it happened, with a book. Hermione had taken to reading at the bottom of her garden, near the gap in the hedge, partly for the light and partly, though she would not have admitted it, because it was the point nearest to number 4. And one gray afternoon, As she sat cross-legged in the long grass turning her pages, she became aware of being watched. She looked up, and there, on the other side of the hedge, half hidden among the leaves, was the thin boy with the taped glasses. He had been drawn, she would later understand, by the simple sight of a child sitting alone and content, doing nothing that could get her into trouble, and he had crept close without quite meaning to, the way a cold creature creeps toward a small warmth. When she looked up, he froze, ready to bolt, expecting, as he always expected, to be shouted at or laughed at or told to go away. Hermione did none of those things. She was too shy to say much at all. Instead, she did the only thing that came naturally to her, which was to hold up her book a little so that he could see the cover, and to smile with her two large front teeth in a way that made plain, without a single word, that she did not mind him being there. And that was all it took. Something in the boy's careful, guarded face eased, just slightly, like a fist beginning to open, and he did not run. He stayed, half hidden in the green, and she went back to her reading. And for a long while, neither of them did anything more than that. They simply sat, on either side of the old hedge, keeping each other company in the failing afternoon light, two solitary children discovering the enormous comfort of a companionable silence. After that first afternoon, it grew easier, as such things do. The next day, he was there again, a little closer. The day after, closer still. Little by little, over the course of that autumn, the gap in the hedge became their meeting place, their green and secret room, a country of their own, no bigger than a cupboard, and infinitely larger than the whole of Privet Drive. There, in whispers, so as not to carry to the sharp-eared house next door, they began at last to talk. Hermione, who had so many words dammed up inside her with no one to give them to, found that they came out of her in a rush, and the boy, who had learned to say as little as possible, found that he liked, more than he could have said, being someone worth talking to. She told him about the books she had read, about faraway places and old kings, and the names of the stars, and he listened as though she were telling him the secrets of the world, which in a way she was. And slowly, in return, he told her things too. Not everything, not at first, for he had been taught to keep silent about his own life and to expect nothing but scorn if he broke that silence. But little by little the shape of it came out, and Hermione, who was clever enough to hear what was not said as clearly as what was, understood more than he told her. She learned about the cupboard under the stairs where he slept, and she was careful not to let her face show the horror she felt, because she sensed that pity was the last thing the boy could bear. She learned that he did not know when his birthday was celebrated, because it never was. She learned that he had been told his parents died in a car crash, and that he had no memory of them at all, only a green flash of light he could not explain, and a pain in his forehead where a thin scar sat, shaped, she thought, rather like a bolt of lightning. She learned all of this in whispers, in the green room of the hedge, and she kept every word of it safe, the way she kept her most precious books, and she never once used any of it against him. And the boy, who had never in his life had such a thing, began to understand what it was to be trusted with someone, and to trust in return. They shared books, of course. That was Hermione's greatest gift, and she gave it freely. She would pass a volume through the gap in the hedge, a story of dragons or islands or clever children who solved impossible mysteries, and he would read it in stolen moments, under the blankets in his cupboard by the light of a torch, and bring it back with careful hands, and they would talk it over in the green room as though they were the only two people in the world who had ever read it, which, for the purposes of their friendship, they were. For the boy, who had never owned a book, and who had been taught by the fat blonde child that reading was for freaks and swats, This was a revelation greater than any story the books themselves contained. Here was a whole world he was allowed into, and here, guarding its door, was a friend who was glad, truly glad, to have him. And for Hermione, it was no less a wonder. She had believed, in the private way of clever, lonely children, that her oddness set her forever apart, that no one would ever quite want the strange, bright, difficult thing that she was. And here, on the other side of a hedge, was a boy who did not find her strange at all, who wanted her words, who saved up small observations through the long gray days simply to tell them to her when they met, who was, in short, her friend, the first true friend of her life. The two of them, each of whom had privately concluded that they were alone in a way that could not be mended, discovered together the astonishing news that they had been wrong. There had been another odd child on the street the whole time. There had been two of them, all along, a few doors apart, waiting without knowing it to be found. They kept their friendship a secret, and this was wise, for the household at number 4 would surely have forbidden it, and Hermione's own kind parents might not have understood the strange and solemn depth of it. But secrecy, far from weakening the bond, only made it stronger, the way a small flame kept out of the wind burns steadier than one left in the open. Through that whole autumn the two children met in the green room of the hedge, and whispered, and read, and simply sat together in the failing light, and each of them went home a little less alone than before. Neither of them yet knew how strange their lives were about to become. Neither of them suspected the truth that lay coiled and waiting inside them both. They knew only that they had found each other, and that it was enough, and for two children who had each expected to be lonely forever, it was very nearly everything. Up next in Chapter 4. Strange Things Neither Could Explain. We'll watch as the odd and impossible events that had always haunted each child alone begin, gently and wondrously, to happen while they are together, and two friends start quietly to guard a secret they cannot yet name. Chapter 4. Strange Things Neither Could Explain. There had always been strange things. Each child had grown up with them, alone, and each had learned, in their separate ways, to be afraid of them. For the boy at number 4, strangeness had brought only punishment. A teacher's wig had once turned blue, and though he had not touched it and could not possibly have reached it, he had been blamed and shut in his cupboard for a week. His hair, shorn nearly to the scalp by his aunt one evening, had grown back entirely overnight, and for that impossible mercy, he had been punished as though it were a crime. He had found himself, fleeing the fat blonde boy and his gang, suddenly and inexplicably on the roof of the school kitchens, with no memory of climbing, and no one had believed that he had not jumped, and no one had wondered how a small boy might jump so high. He had learned, therefore, that the strange things were dangerous, that they came upon him without warning, and that they always brought trouble down upon his head. For Hermione, the strangeness had been gentler, but no less lonely. Books she wanted had a way of being nearer than she had left them. A cup she reached for would sometimes slide the last inch across the table into her hand. Once, frightened by a large dog, she had found herself atop a garden wall she had no memory of climbing, and her puzzled parents had decided, kindly, that she must have scrambled up in her fright and simply forgotten. She had not corrected them. She had learned, being a clever and careful child, that these things were not to be spoken of, that they made grown adults uneasy and other children cruel, and so she had folded them away with all her other oddities and told no one. She had assumed, as each of them had assumed, that she was the only person in the world to whom such impossible things happened, and that whatever was wrong with her, it was hers alone to carry. And then, In the green and secret room of the hedge, the two of them came together, and the strange things began to happen while they were both there to see. The first time, it was very small. They were sitting in the long grass with a book between them, and a wasp came drifting close, and the boy, who had a horror of them, flinched back, and the wasp, in the very instant of his flinching, was flicked away sideways through the air as though a great invisible hand had brushed it aside, and it sailed off over the hedge and was gone. The two children looked at the empty air where it had been, and then at each other, and neither of them said anything, because neither of them knew what there was to say. But Hermione's heart was beating very fast, and not entirely from fear, because she had seen the boy's hand move, and she had seen the wasp answer it, and for the first time in her life, she had watched one of the strange things happen to somebody other than herself. After that, they began, cautiously, to notice. It was as though, once they had each stopped being alone with it, the strangeness felt safe enough to show itself more often. On a rainy afternoon, the boy pressed his hand flat against the misted glass of the greenhouse where they had sheltered, and where his hand had been the glass turned briefly to nothing at all. A clean round hole of open air before it swam back into being. Hermione, wanting a book from the far end of the garden, glanced at it and wished for it, and it came to her, skidding through the wet grass into her lap, and she did not pretend, this time, that she had not done it. Once, chased in play by nothing more frightening than a friendly cat, Hermione leapt for the low branch of the apple tree and rose far higher than any child could rise, drifting up onto the roof of the garden, shed as lightly as a blown leaf, and sat there laughing, breathless, while the boy stared up at her with wonder breaking across his face like sunrise. And here was the thing that changed everything, the thing that made all the difference in the world. When these impossible events had happened to each of them alone, they had been frightening, because there had been no one to share them with, and no one to believe them, and only punishment or worried silence waiting on the other side. But now there were two of them. Now, when the glass vanished, or the book flew, or a child rose into the air, there was another child there who had seen it, who was not frightened, who was, if anything, delighted. The strange things stopped being a curse to be hidden, and became, quietly, a secret to be shared, and there is all the difference in the world between a curse and a shared secret. A curse isolates. A secret binds. They talked about it in whispers, as they talked about everything, in the green room of the hedge. They compared their strangenesses the way other children might compare grazed knees or lost teeth, and found, to their amazement, that they matched. Things had moved for both of them. Things had grown back for both of them. Both of them had leapt, or drifted, or fallen upward when they were frightened. Neither of them could explain any of it, and neither of them could make it happen on purpose, not reliably, for it came and went with their feelings like weather. But both of them, now, knew that they were not alone in it, and that knowledge was worth more than any explanation. Hermione, who loved above all things to understand, found that for once she did not mind not understanding, so long as she did not have to understand it by herself. They agreed, without ever quite putting it into words, that it must be kept secret. They did not need to be told. They had each learned that lesson long ago, and separately, and they had the scars, one of them a very literal scar, to prove it. The world of Privet Drive did not like strange things. The world of Privet Drive clipped its hedges to the same height and parked its cars in the same way and watched from behind its curtains for anyone who dared to be different. And both children understood, in their bones, that what happened in the green room of the hedge would not be safe if it were carried out into the open. So, they guarded it. They became, at an age when most children can scarcely keep a birthday surprise, the joint keepers of a great and impossible secret. and the keeping of it drew them closer still. What neither of them knew, sitting there in the long grass with the whole vast truth of it just beyond the edge of their understanding, was that there was a word for what they were. There was a word, and a world, and a school far to the north with towers and staircases, and a great hall lit by floating candles, where children exactly like them learned to make the strange things happen on purpose, and to call it by its proper name. They did not know that letters were being written somewhere in green ink, or that owls would one day come. They knew only what they could see and feel, which was that something extraordinary lived inside each of them, and that, wonderfully, impossibly, it lived inside the other too. And so they sat together in the deepening autumn, two small keepers of a secret they could not yet name, waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for the morning the whole world would change. Up next in Chapter 5, The Library as a Refuge, we'll follow the two friends into the warm and quiet shelter of the little winging library, where among the silent shelves, two solitary children found a safe harbor from the cold house next door, and were happiest of all. The little library of Little Wingjing sat at the quiet end of a quiet road, a low brick building with tall windows and a green door that stuck a little in damp weather. It was not a grand place. There was no marble, no great staircase, nothing that a visitor from a city might have found remarkable. There were only shelves and lamps that glowed a soft honey color in the afternoons, and a smell of old paper and floor polish that seemed to settle over everything like a warm blanket. And yet, for two children on Privet Drive, it became the safest place in all the world. Hermione had found it first, of course. She had found it the way she found most good things, by wandering, by asking, by following her own curiosity down streets that other children never bothered to explore. On a gray Saturday, in her second year on the street, she had walked in alone, breathed in that smell of paper, and known at once that she had come home to somewhere she had never been before. She had spent that whole first afternoon simply moving along the shelves, tilting her head to read the spines, pulling out one book and then another, until the librarian, a gentle woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, had come to tell her softly that it was nearly time to close. After that, Hermione went every week that she could, and it was not very long before she began to bring Harry with her. Getting Harry to the library was, in the beginning, a small and delicate operation. The Dursleys did not care for the idea of Harry going anywhere at all, and they cared least of all for the idea of Harry going somewhere that might make him cleverer or happier. But a library was a difficult thing for even Aunt Petunia to object to out loud. It was free, it was respectable, it kept the boy out of the house and cost her nothing. And so, on a great many Saturday mornings, Harry was permitted to leave number 4, and he would slip along the hedge to where Hermione was waiting, and the two of them would walk the several streets together, talking the whole way until the green door came into view. Inside, everything changed. Inside, Harry was not the strange boy from the cupboard, and Hermione was not the odd girl with too much hair and too many words. Inside, they were simply two readers among the shelves, and no one troubled them, and no one told them they were not wanted. The librarian came to know them both by sight, and she saved certain books for them, and she never once asked the sorts of questions that grown-ups so often asked, the ones about family and home and why a boy should be so very thin. Hermione took it upon herself, gently and without ever quite announcing it, to teach Harry how to lose himself in a book. It was not that Harry could not read. It was that he had never before had the chance to read for the sheer pleasure of it, to sink into a story and forget the ticking of the clock and the sound of his own uneasy heart. Hermione showed him how. She led him to the shelves of adventure tales first, stories of islands and treasure and brave voyages, because she had guessed correctly that a boy who lived in a cupboard would long above all things for wide-open spaces and the sea. She would find him a book, press it into his hands, and then leave him alone with it, taking herself off to her own corner so that he might discover the thing in his own time and his own way. And Harry did discover it. Slowly, over many weeks, the library worked its quiet magic on him. He learned to read the way a thirsty person learns to drink, deeply and gratefully. He found that a book could take him out of Privet Drive entirely, could lift him clean over the hedges and the pinched gray rooftops, and set him down somewhere vast and free. He began to save his favorite passages to tell Hermione about afterward, and she began to save hers. And their walks home filled up with the retelling of stories, each of them talking over the other in their eagerness, both of them warmer and lighter than when they had set out. They had their places. Hermione preferred a small table near the reference section, where the heavy books lived, the encyclopedias and atlases and the great dictionaries that she liked to open at random, simply to see what she might learn. Harry preferred the window. There was one deep window seat, worn soft by many years of readers, that caught the pale afternoon light, and he would fold himself into it with a book across his knees and read until his eyes ached. Sometimes Hermione would look up from her table and see him there, lit gold by the window, utterly still, utterly absorbed, and something in her chest would go quiet and glad, because she knew that for those hours at least he was safe, and he was happy, and he was far away from the people who did not love him. They read a great many things in that library. They read about far countries, and about the deep sea, and about the stars. Hermione read about history, and about the natural world, and about how machines worked, and why the tides came in and out. Harry read stories mostly, stories of ordinary boys who turned out to be brave. Stories of orphans who found, in the last chapter, that they had been someone important all along. Neither of them knew, in those years, how near to the truth such stories would prove for them both. Neither of them knew what was coming. They knew only the pleasure of the present hour, the two of them side by side among the shelves, the lamps glowing, the rain sometimes tapping at the tall windows while they read on, dry and warm and together. And there was a further gift in the library, one that neither child spoke of, but both of them felt. It was a place where the strange things did not seem so strange. Out in the world, the odd occurrences that seemed to follow them, the glass that vanished, the sudden impossible leaps, the small, unexplained happenings, made them feel set apart and uneasy. But here, surrounded by books that spoke of every wonder under the sun, of creatures that had once been thought impossible, and lands that had once been thought myth, it was easier to believe that the world was larger and stranger than the grown-ups of Privet Drive would ever admit. Here, among 1,000 pages, the two of them could almost believe that there might be a place, somewhere, where children like themselves belonged. The librarian, on the evenings when she locked up behind them, would sometimes stand a moment in the doorway and watch the two small figures walk away down the darkening street, close together, heads bent in talk. She thought them a curious pair. She thought the girl fierce and clever, and the boy quiet and kind. And she thought that whatever homes they went back to, they had clearly found something better in each other. She was not wrong. She could not have guessed the half of it, but she was not wrong. So the seasons of reading passed, spring into summer, into the first cool breath of autumn, and the library held them both, and the friendship deepened among the shelves in a way that no ordinary friendship ever quite does. They were bound now, not only by the hedge and the secret gap between the gardens, but by every story they had shared and every quiet afternoon spent side by side in the honey-colored light. Whatever else the world might do to them, it could not take those hours away. Up next in Chapter 6, A Winter of Quiet Kindnesses, we'll follow the two children through a long, cold season and watch a girl learn how to look after a hungry boy and see a friendship grow warmer as the days grow short and dark. The winter came slowly to Little Whinging that year, the way winter always does in the flat green counties of southern England. First, the leaves turned and fell, gathering in soft brown drifts along the gutters of Privet Drive. Then, the light began to fail earlier and earlier, so that by 4 in the afternoon the street lamps were already glowing and the front rooms of the neat houses shone yellow behind their curtains. Then, at last, the true cold arrived, a still and biting cold that put frost on the hedges every morning and turned each breath to a small white cloud. It was a hard season, but it was, for two children on that street, a season of small and quiet kindnesses, and those kindnesses were mostly Hermione's. Hermione had understood, long before she could have put it into words, that Harry was not fed as a boy ought to be fed. She had noticed it in 100 small ways, the way children notice things without meaning to. She had seen how thin his wrists were, how his uniform hung loose upon him, how he watched food with a quiet, careful attention that other children never did. She had seen how, on the days when Dudley Dursley had eaten his fill and more, Harry was given whatever was left, which was often very little. She had never once heard Harry complain of it. That, somehow, was the part that troubled her most. He did not complain, because he did not know that things could be any other way. So Hermione began, quietly, to feed him. It was never anything grand, and she was careful to make it look like nothing at all, because she understood, even at that age, that a proud and lonely boy would sooner go hungry than be pitied. She simply began to bring more than she needed. When she came to the hedge to meet him, she would happen to have 2 apples in her coat, and would happen not to want one of them, and would press it upon him as though he were doing her a favor by taking it off her hands. She would arrive at their meeting place with a paper bag of sandwiches that her mother had made, far more than one small girl could eat, and she would share them out on the cold ground between the gardens, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. On the sharpest mornings, she brought a thermos flask of soup, warm and steaming, and they would pass it back and forth between them, and Harry's hands would slowly stop their shivering as he cupped the metal and drank. Mrs. Granger, Hermione's mother, never quite understood where her sandwiches went, though she noticed that her daughter's appetite had grown remarkably that winter. She said nothing, only made a little more each day, because she was a kind woman and because she had begun, without knowing the particulars, to sense that her daughter was carrying something. Hermione never told her parents the whole of it. She never explained about the boy at number 4, about the cupboard, about the coldness of that house. Some things a child keeps, out of loyalty, out of a fierce protective love that has no need of explanation. But she carried a little more from the Granger kitchen each day, and a little more found its way to Harry, and that was how the thing was done. There were other kindnesses too, smaller even than the food. When Harry's hands were raw and red with the cold, because the Dursleys had not thought to give him gloves, Hermione turned up one morning with a spare pair of her own. Mittens, really, a soft, dark blue. And she declared with great firmness that they had never fitted her, and that he would be doing her a service by taking them. And Harry, who knew perfectly well what she was doing, and loved her the more for the way she pretended not to be doing it, took the mittens and wore them all that winter. When his old shoes let in the wet, she found him a pair of thick socks. When his scarf, which was really Dudley's cast off, unraveled at one end. She mended it with a needle and thread she had borrowed from her mother's sewing box, sitting cross-legged in the cold to do it, her tongue between her teeth in concentration. And Harry, who had spent his short life on the receiving end of unkindness, learned that winter what it was to be looked after. It was a strange and almost frightening thing for him at first. He was so unused to being cared for that he hardly knew how to accept it, and there were moments when the sheer unfamiliar warmth of it seemed almost too much to bear. But Hermione was patient, and she never made a great show of her caring, and slowly Harry came to trust it. He came to expect, on the coldest mornings, that there would be soup. He came to know that if his hands were cold, someone in the world would notice and would mind. It was a small thing, perhaps, to a child who had always had it. To Harry, it was very nearly everything, nor was the caring only in one direction. Harry looked after Hermione too, in the ways that a boy could. When the older children on the street were cruel to her, mocking her hair or her cleverness, or the eager way she raised her hand in class, Harry stood close beside her. And though he was thin and small, he had a steadiness about him that made the mockers think twice. When she cried, which was not often, for she was a proud girl, he did not fuss or flap, but simply sat with her in the shelter of the hedge until the crying was done. When she talked, and Hermione talked a great deal, he listened, truly listened, in a way that the grown-ups in her life, busy and distracted, often did not. He was the first person in all her life who never once seemed to wish that she would talk a little less. So the two of them looked out for one another through that long, cold season, and the winter, which might have been bleak for both, became instead something almost tender. They had their rituals. On Saturdays there was the library, warm and bright against the gray. On the walks there was the soup, passed hand to hand. On the coldest nights, when Harry lay awake in his cupboard listening to the wind, he had a new thing to think of that he had never had before, which was that somewhere along the street, a few doors down, there was a person who thought of him and cared whether he was warm. It is difficult to say what a thought like that is worth to a lonely child. It cannot be measured, but it kept him through that winter in a way that nothing else ever had. Christmas came and went. At number 4, it was a great business of presents and rich food, none of it for Harry, who received a single toothpick one year and thought himself lucky it was not worse. But Hermione had saved for him. She had put by her own small coins through the autumn, and she had bought him, in secret, a book, a proper new one of his very own, the first he had ever owned, a tale of the sea and of a long voyage home. She gave it to him in the shelter of the hedge on a frozen morning, wrapped in brown paper, and Harry held it for a long moment before he opened it, because he could scarcely believe that something new and good should belong to him and to no one else. It was the best gift he had ever been given. He kept it hidden beneath the loose floorboard in his cupboard, and on the hardest nights he took it out and held it in the dark. And it comforted him. And so the winter turned, at last, towards spring, and the two children came through it together, warmer than they had any right to be, bound tighter than ever by all the small kindnesses of a hard, cold season. Up next, in Chapter 7, 2 letters on the same morning, we'll wake with the two friends on a bright day that will change everything, and watch 2 envelopes arrive next door to one another and see a whole hidden world begin to open at last. The morning it happened was a bright one, the kind of clear early summer morning that comes to England now and then as though to make up for all the gray. The sky over Little Winging was a pale washed blue, and the light lay warm across the neat front gardens of Privet Drive, and the milk float hummed its slow way along the street as it did on every ordinary day. Nothing about that morning gave any sign that it was not ordinary, and yet it was the most extraordinary morning in the lives of two children, for it was the morning the letters came. At number 4 Privet Drive, the post fell through the letterbox with its usual soft clatter, and it was Harry, as always, who was sent to fetch it. He gathered up the bills and the dull brown envelopes and a postcard from Aunt Petunia's sister, and he was turning back toward the kitchen when he saw it. There, at the bottom of the little pile, was a letter addressed to him. It was a thick letter, heavy, made of a stiff yellowish parchment, quite unlike any paper he had ever seen. It was sealed with wax, a deep red wax bearing the print of a curious crest, a lion and an eagle, and a badger and a serpent gathered around a great letter H. And on the front, in emerald green ink, in a fine slanting hand, was written his own name, and beneath it, most astonishing of all, the exact place where he slept. Not merely the house, not merely the street. The letter knew about the cupboard under the stairs. Harry stood very still in the hall, holding the letter, and for a moment the ordinary world seemed to tilt gently around him. No one had ever written to him before. No one in all his life had ever sent him anything at all. And here was a letter that knew him, that knew where he lived down to the smallest and most secret detail, addressed in green ink as though he were a person who mattered. His heart was beating very hard. He had only just time to slip the letter inside his shirt, out of sight, before Uncle Vernon's voice came booming from the kitchen, demanding to know what was keeping the boy. A few doors down the same street, on that same bright morning, a second letter had arrived. At the Granger house, the post came a little later, for the postman worked his way down the road, and Hermione was already at the breakfast table with a book propped open against the marmalade when her mother brought it in. Mrs. Granger sorted through the envelopes with the mild attention of a woman expecting nothing more interesting than a gas bill, and then she stopped, and she frowned, and she held out to her daughter a thick yellowish envelope sealed with red wax and addressed in emerald green. Hermione took it. She turned it over in her hands. She read her own name, and beneath it the address of the house, and beneath that, in the same fine hand, the words that named the very room in which she slept. Hermione was a clever child, cleverer than most grown people, and she prided herself on being able to explain a thing, on being able to trace any mystery back to its reasonable cause. But she could not explain this. She could not think how any ordinary person could have known which bedroom was hers. She could not think what school would write to a child on heavy parchment sealed with wax and lettered in green. She opened it carefully, sliding her thumb beneath the seal, and she drew out the pages, and she began to read, and as she read her eyes grew very wide. It was a letter of acceptance. It was an invitation worded with great courtesy to attend a school. But it was no school that Hermione had ever heard of, no school that appeared in any of the many books she had read. It was a school of witchcraft and wizardry, a place called Hogwarts, and the letter said, in the plainest and most matter-of-fact way, that Hermione Granger had been offered a place there, and that she was a witch. For a long moment, Hermione did not move. A part of her, the sensible part, the part that knew there was no such thing as magic, wanted to laugh and set the letter aside as somebody's elaborate joke. But another part of her, a deeper and quieter part, was not surprised at all. That part of her was thinking of the strange things. It was thinking of the time the glass had seemed to melt away. It was thinking of the impossible leaps, the objects that had come to her hand when she had wanted them, the 100 small events over the years that she had never once been able to explain, however hard she tried. And all at once, sitting at the breakfast table with the marmalade going soft in the sun, Hermione understood. There was a reason. There had always been a reason. She was not broken, and she was not strange. She was a witch, and there was a whole world she belonged to, and it had just written to her in green ink to call her home. Her first thought, her very first thought after the wonder of it, was of Harry. She could not have said, in that moment, why she was so sure. But she was sure, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that if such a letter had come to her, then such a letter must have come to him. The strange things had never happened to her alone. They had happened when the two of them were together, both of them, side by side. Whatever she was, Harry was too. She knew it the way she knew her own name, and so, scarcely pausing to answer her astonished parents, Hermione was up from the table and out of the door and running down Privet Drive toward number 4, the letter clutched in her hand and her heart high in her throat. At number 4, meanwhile, matters had gone very differently. Uncle Vernon had seen the green ink. Uncle Vernon had gone first purple and then a shade of gray, and he had snatched the letter from Harry's hands. And there had been a great and terrible fuss, for the Dursleys knew, as Harry did not yet know, exactly what that letter meant, and they had spent 11 years hoping with all their hearts that it would never come. There was shouting. There was a slamming of doors. Uncle Vernon declared that no letter would be answered, that no boy of his was going off to any such place, that the whole matter was finished and would never be spoken of again. The letter was locked away. Harry was sent to his cupboard, and it seemed, for a black hour, that the door to the whole hidden world had been slammed shut in his face. But then there was a knock at the front door, small and insistent, and when Aunt Petunia opened it, thin-lipped and furious, there stood a girl with a great deal of brown hair and a fierce light in her eyes and a thick yellowish letter held up in her hand like a banner. And Harry, listening from within his cupboard, heard Hermione's voice and understood that she had come, and understood in the same instant that whatever this was, whatever wonder and whatever change was breaking over their lives that bright summer morning, it had broken over both of them at once. He was not receiving it alone. He would not have to face it alone. She had a letter too. The Dursleys could rage as they liked. They could lock away one letter, and then another, and then a dozen more. But two children now knew the truth of themselves, and they knew it together, and there is no lock in all the world strong enough to shut two such children out of their own destiny for long. Up next in Chapter 8, diagonally side by side, we'll step at last through the hidden door into the wizarding world and walk a cobbled street of wonders and choose first robes and first wands, no longer as one lonely boy, but as two friends together. In the end, the letters could not be stopped. They came again, and then again, more of them each day, until they poured down the chimney of number 4 and slid under the doors and filled the little house like a snowfall, and even Uncle Vernon, for all his purple fury, could not hold back the tide. And there came at last a keeper of keys and grounds from the school itself, a very large and very kind man, to explain what had to be explained and to set matters right. But that is a story of its own. What matters to us here is what came after, when the truth was fully out and the way was clear, and two children from Privet Drive made their first journey together into the hidden heart of the wizarding world. The way in was through a small and shabby public house in London, a place so dingy and unremarkable that the crowds of ordinary people flowed past it on the pavement without ever seeming to see it at all. Hermione noticed that at once, the way the eyes of the passers-by slid over the little inn as though it were not there, and she filed the observation away in her tidy mind as her first true piece of magical knowledge. Inside, The place was dim and low-ceilinged and full of soft murmuring, and there were figures in long robes and a great many curious hats, and Harry and Hermione walked through it side by side with their eyes very wide. And then, at the back, there was a small walled yard, and a certain pattern of bricks tapped in a certain order, and the wall folded itself away, arch by arch, to reveal the street beyond. Diagon Alley opened before them like a page turning in the finest book either of them had ever read. It was a long cobbled street that wound away between crooked buildings, and it was crowded, and it was loud in the pleasant way that a busy market is loud, and it was full, from end to end, of the most wonderful things. There were shops with cauldrons stacked outside their doors, great copper cauldrons and small pewter ones and cauldrons that folded up to nothing at all. There was an apothecary from whose open door came a smell of strange spices and stranger things, of dried herbs and powdered roots and substances neither child could name. There was a shop that sold nothing but broomsticks, and outside its window a small crowd of children stood, pressed against the glass, gazing at a gleaming broom laid out upon a velvet cushion, as though it were a crown. Overhead, owls flew, and posters flapped, and the whole street glittered and hummed and turned in the summer light. For Harry, who had spent his whole life in the gray narrowness of Privet Drive, it was almost too much to take in. He walked slowly, turning about, his head tilting up at the leaning rooftops, and there was upon his face an expression of pure and open wonder that Hermione had never quite seen there before. For Hermione, it was wonder too, but wonder of a different kind. She wanted to understand it all. She wanted to know how the cauldrons were graded, and what the apothecary's jars contained, and why the broomstick cost so very much. And she went from window to window, reading every sign and label she could find, storing it all away. And the finest thing of all, the thing that made that day unlike any imagining either of them had ever had, was that they saw it together. Every wonder was doubled, because there was someone beside each of them to turn to, someone to catch the eye of, someone with whom to share the astonishment of it all. They had their money now, for the wizarding world kept its gold in a great white bank deep underground, and there were funds set aside for each of them, and so they were able to buy what the long list in the letter required. They went first for their robes, into a small shop where a kindly witch measured them with a tape that moved by itself, and they stood upon the little stools and were fitted for the plain black robes that every first year wore. And they looked at one another across the shop, each in their new robes, and something passed between them that was half laughter and half disbelief, that this should be real, that this should be theirs. They bought their books next, and this was Hermione's happiest hour of all, for the bookshop of Diagon Alley was a place of towering shelves crammed from floor to ceiling, with volumes bound in leather and cloth and stranger materials besides, some of them chained, some of them muttering softly to themselves, some of them so large that it took both hands to lift them. Hermione moved among them in a state of quiet rapture, and Harry, watching her, was glad, for he had never once seen her among books that were not from the little library of Little Whinging, and there was a rightness in seeing her here, in her true place at last. She bought all the set books, and then, when no one was quite looking, a few more besides, because she could not bear to leave them behind. They bought a cauldron each, and scales, and a set of files, and a telescope for the study of the stars. And then, at the very end, they came to the thing that both of them, in their different ways, had been most quietly longing for. They came to the wand shop. It was a narrow and dusty and very old shop, and it was so quiet inside, after the bustle of the street, that both children lowered their voices without meaning to. There were thousands of narrow boxes stacked in tottering piles to the ceiling, and there was a stillness in the air that seemed almost to hum, as though the place were waiting. The wand maker was an old man with pale eyes that seemed to see a great deal, and he served them one at a time, and it was a curious and solemn business, the choosing of a wand. Box after box was opened. Wand after wand was tried and set aside. And then, for each of them in turn, there came the right one, the one that fit. And when Harry's hand closed upon his wand, there was a sudden warmth in his fingers, and a stream of red and gold sparks that lit the dim shop like a small firework. And when Hermione's found her a moment later, there came a warmth of her own and a soft flurry of light. And the old wand maker watched them both with his pale eyes and said little, but seemed to be thinking a great deal. They walked back up the cobbled street afterward with their arms full of parcels, tired and dazzled and happier perhaps than either of them had ever been. They stopped at last outside the shop that sold owls and other creatures, and there, among the cages, Harry was given a snowy white owl. A beautiful thing with feathers the color of new snow and eyes like amber, and she settled upon his arm as though she had always known him. Hermione chose a cat, a small ginger creature with a squashed and clever face, who regarded her with an air of grave approval and consented to be carried home. And so the two of them stood together in the golden evening light of Diagon Alley, a boy with an owl and a girl with a cat, laden with all the strange and wonderful things they would need for the great adventure ahead. They had begun their lives on the same gray street, two lonely children with a secret they could not name. And now, the secret had a name, and a world, and a place waiting for them both. Whatever came next, they would meet it as they had met everything, side by side. Up next in Chapter 9, the Scarlet Engine and a Shared Compartment will board a great red train bound for a castle in the north, and find a place to sit, and meet a red-haired boy named Ron, and watch a friendship of three begin to grow from a friendship already years old. The morning they left for Hogwarts was soft and gray, the kind of early hour when the streets of Little Whinging still slept and the milk had not yet been set out on the doorsteps. Two families made their way to King's Cross Station along different roads, the Grangers in their neat family car with the trolley folded in the back, and Harry brought along in the Dursleys' vehicle as a kind of afterthought, dropped at the barrier with as little ceremony as they could manage. Yet even the great cold station could not undo what had already been built between the two children over so many years. They found each other quickly on the crowded platform, as they always had found each other, drawn together the way two small lights leaned toward one another in a wide, dark room. Hermione had read about the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 in one of her new books, and she had read the instructions carefully, and she had read them again, and she had memorized the exact manner of walking straight at the seemingly solid brick between the two platforms. But it was one thing to read a sentence, and quite another to trust one's own body to a wall. And so the two of them stood before it together for a long, breathless moment. Harry had grown used to strange things by now, having spent his whole childhood beside a friend to whom impossible things happened, and Hermione had grown used to being brave in the company of the one person who never laughed at her for knowing too much. They went through together, side by side, and the wall received them the way water receives a swimmer. And then they were standing somewhere else entirely. The platform beyond was called 9 3/4, and it was full of steam and voices and the strange, soft roar of a place where the ordinary world had been quietly folded away. A scarlet engine stood along the length of it, enormous and gleaming, breathing out great white clouds that drifted along the ceiling and among the many legs of the many travelers. Owls hooted from within their cages. A large striped cat wound its way between trunks. Boys and girls in ordinary clothes and boys and girls already in long black robes moved along the train, and mothers wiped smudges from faces, and older brothers pretended to be too grown for tearful goodbyes. Hermione stood very still and took it all in, and Harry stood beside her and did the same. And neither of them needed to say a single word about the wonder of it, because they had been sharing wonders since they were very small. They chose a compartment near the middle of the train, a small snug room with worn seats and a window that showed the whole busy platform. They heaved their heavy trunks up between them, both of them straining, both of them laughing quietly at how heavy books and cauldrons could be. And at last the trunks were stowed, and they sat down across from one another, as the whistle blew somewhere far along the great length of the engine. The train began to move, and the platform slid away, and the two of them watched the last of the parents grow small and vanish, and then there was only the countryside pouring past the glass, green and endless and washed with morning. It was not long before the door of the compartment slid open. A boy stood in the gap, tall and thin and freckled, with a great deal of very red hair and a smudge on his nose that he did not seem to know about. He asked, in a shy and hopeful way, whether the other seats were taken, for the rest of the train seemed already full. Hermione, who had learned over many years that lonely people recognize one another, moved her bag at once to make room, and Harry, who knew better than most what it was to stand in a doorway hoping to be let in, gestured to the empty seat beside him. The boy sat down gratefully. His name was Ron Weasley, and he came from a family so large that hand-me-down robes and a hand-me-down wand and a very old fat gray rat were simply the ordinary furniture of his life. What followed was not the meeting of strangers so much as the widening of a circle that had held only two for a very long time. Ron was startled, as everyone in the magical world seemed to be, to find himself sitting across from Harry Potter, whose name he had heard spoken in the hushed way that grown wizards spoke of the terrible years now past. But the strangeness of that fame softened almost at once, because Harry did not carry himself as a famous boy. He carried himself as a boy who had a best friend already, one who nudged him when he grew too quiet and finished his sentences when he grew too shy. And Ron found that there was room in that friendship, that it was not a closed door, but an open one. They talked of many things as the train carried them north. Ron explained the great sprawling shape of the wizarding world he had been born into, the games and the sweets and the older brothers who had gone before him, and Hermione listened with the particular hunger of someone who had learned everything she knew from books, and now, at last, was hearing it from a living voice. Harry, who had grown up in a cupboard beneath a staircase, listened too, and the three of them found that between the boy raised without magic, the girl raised without magic, and the boy raised with nothing but magic, there was a whole world to be shared out and marveled over together. A round-faced woman came by with a trolley of sweets that none of them had ever seen, chocolate frogs that leapt and cards that moved, and beans that dared you to taste them. And Ron, who never had spending money on the train, watched with the quiet ache of a boy accustomed to going without. Harry, who had a small pouch of gold now for the first time in his life, bought a great heap of everything and set it in the middle of the seat and shared it out among the three of them without a second thought, because he had learned kindness at the hands of the one friend who had ever shown him any. And kindness passed from him now as naturally as breathing. Hermione watched the two boys divide the chocolate frogs and felt the warm and settled feeling of a circle drawing closed around her. There was a small commotion at one point. A boy who had lost his toad, a plump, anxious boy named Neville, and Hermione was up at once to help him search, brisk and kind and endlessly capable, the way she had always been brisk and kind when Harry had needed her over the years. And there was, later, a pale boy with two large companions who put his head into the compartment and spoke coldly and left again unwelcomed, but he made little mark on the afternoon. The three friends had one another, and the sweets, and the long golden light of the day pouring across the fields, and a castle waiting somewhere ahead of them in the gathering dark. By the time the countryside outside the window had turned to dusk, and the fields had gone blue and then black, the three of them had changed into their long black school robes, and a voice had echoed along the train, telling them they would soon arrive. Hermione and Harry exchanged a look then. The look of two children who had walked a very long road together to reach this exact and glittering moment. And Ron, watching them, understood that he had wandered into something old and good, and had been made welcome inside it. Up next in Chapter 10, A Hat That Paused a Long Time, we'll follow the three of them into the great candlelit hall, and watch an ancient hat weigh each young heart, and wonder whether two friends bound since childhood might, at the very last, be gently pulled apart. The boats carried them across the black water, in the dark, small wooden boats gliding without oars, and the first the new students saw of the castle was a great cliff of golden windows rising against the night sky. So many lit rooms stacked one above another that the whole thing seemed a mountain of soft, warm lamps. Hermione sat with her hands folded very tightly in her lap, and Harry sat beside her, and Ron sat across, and none of them spoke, because there are sights so large that words fall silent before them. The lake lay smooth as glass beneath the boats, and above the towers the stars came out one by one, and Hogwarts drew nearer and nearer until it filled the whole of the sky. They were led up from the water by a very tall and kindly giant of a man who carried a lamp, and then through the great doors, and into a stone chamber where a stern-faced witch in emerald robes waited to gather them. She told them, in a calm and measured voice, that in a few moments they would pass through into the great hall and be sorted into their houses, and that their houses would be something like their family within the school for all the years to come. Hermione had read of the 4 houses, had memorized their names and their qualities, and something of their long histories, and yet all her reading did nothing now to quiet the small, cold fear that had settled beneath her ribs. For the truth that she had not let herself think until this moment was very simple. She and Harry might be sorted apart. It was a fear that Harry felt too, standing beside her in the crowd of nervous first-years, though he had done far less reading and far more worrying. They had been each other's whole world once, 2 lonely children on an unkind street. And though the world had widened wonderfully since then, the oldest fear does not vanish merely because a person grows. Harry looked at Hermione, and Hermione looked back at Harry, and in that shared glance was the memory of every winter afternoon spent whispering through a hedge. Every book passed from one small hand to another. Every unkindness they had weathered by leaning on one another. Whatever house took them, they promised each other silently they would remain what they had always been. The doors opened, and they walked in a long, uncertain line into the great hall, and it took their breath away all over again. 4 long tables ran the length of the room, crowded with older students in black robes, and above them floated thousands of candles, hanging in the air without strings, their flames steady and gold. The ceiling far overhead was not a ceiling at all, but a mirror of the night sky, deep velvet blue and strewn with stars, so that the whole hall seemed roofed in nothing but the heavens. At the far end sat the teachers at a long, high table, and in the center of them, in a great carved chair, sat an old wizard with a long silver beard and half-moon spectacles, whose eyes were gentle even from that great distance. Upon a stool, before the high table, sat a single object, an old and patched and pointed wizard's hat, worn and frayed at the brim, looking for all the world like something forgotten in an attic. And then, To the amazement of the new students, a rip near the brim opened wide like a mouth, and the hat sang. It sang of the 4 founders of the school, and of the 4 houses each had made, of brave Gryffindor and wise Ravenclaw, of loyal Hufflepuff and clever Slytherin, and it promised to look inside the head of each child and find where they truly belonged. When the song ended, the whole hall applauded, and Hermione, who found comfort in understanding a thing, felt a very little steadier for knowing at last how the sorting would be done. The stern witch unrolled a long scroll and began to call names, and one by one the first years walked forward and sat upon the stool, and the great hat was lowered over their eyes. Some it sorted in a single instant, calling out a house almost before it had touched their hair. Others it took longer over, and the whole hall watched and waited. When Hermione's name was called, she walked forward with her chin held high, though her heart was beating very fast, and she sat upon the stool, and the hat came down over her eyes and shut out the golden hall. And the hat paused a long time over her. It murmured to her of a fine and hungry mind, of a memory that held everything it was given, of a girl who could have gone to the house of the wise and worn their colors proudly. But it found, deeper down, beneath all that learning, something the hat had not expected in so bookish a child. It found courage. It found the particular quiet courage of a girl who had spent her whole childhood standing between an unkind household and a lonely boy, who had chosen, over and over, to be brave for the sake of someone she loved. The hat weighed the wisdom against the bravery for a long, long moment, and then it made its choice, and it called out the name of Gryffindor, and the table on the far left of the hall erupted in cheers. Hermione went to sit among them, glowing, and turned at once to watch the stool. For Harry's turn came soon after, and the hat paused a long time over him as well. It whispered to him of many things, of cunning and of thirst, of a talent that might have carried him to great heights in the House of the Serpent. But Harry, sitting in the dark beneath the brim with his eyes shut tight, thought only of one thing, and thought it as hard as he could. He thought of the girl who had just been sorted into Gryffindor, the friend who had fed him through a cold winter and taught him to lose himself in books and made his whole gray childhood bearable. He did not know whether the hat could hear such a wish, but he made it anyway, with all his heart. And whether the hat heard him, or whether it had already found in him the brave heart it looked for, it drew back at last from all its long deliberation and called out the name of Gryffindor, and Harry's whole body loosened with relief. He went to the Gryffindor table almost at a run, and Hermione moved along the bench to make room for him, and the two of them sat side by side beneath the floating candles, safe and together and home. Not long after, the name of Ron Weasley was called, and the hat, which had sorted every one of his many brothers into the same house, barely needed a moment before it sent him to Gryffindor as well, and he came and dropped onto the bench across from them with a wide, relieved grin. The circle that had formed upon the train was whole again, and now it had a place to sit, and colors to wear, and a house to call its own. The old wizard with the silver beard rose then and spoke a few warm and slightly puzzling words of welcome, and food appeared upon the golden plates, as though from nowhere, more food than Harry had ever in his life been permitted to eat. And the three friends filled their plates and talked and laughed beneath the starry ceiling until they were warm and full and drowsy. And when at last they were led up the great moving staircases to the tower where the Gryffindors slept, Hermione and Harry parted at the foot of the stairs to their separate dormitories, with the easy contentment of two people who no longer had to fear being pulled apart, because the oldest thing they had was safe. Up next in Chapter 11, A Mountain Troll and No Need to Lie, we'll see the two friends face a great and frightening danger deep in the castle, and discover that a friendship built over years needs no brave and hasty untruth to hold it together. The weeks that followed the sorting settled into the gentle rhythm of a first term at school. And for two children who had grown up starved of belonging, that rhythm was a quiet marvel all its own. There were lessons in high stone rooms where feathers were made to float and matches were coaxed into needles. And there was the greenhouse warmth of the herbology beds. And there was the smell of old parchment in the great library, which Hermione discovered on the very first day and adopted at once as the truest home she had ever had. She and Harry walked the corridors together as they had walked the streets of Little Whinging together. And Ron walked with them now, and the three of them were rarely apart. Hermione took to her lessons with a joy that some of the other children found a little bewildering. She answered questions before the teachers had quite finished asking them, and she read far ahead in every book, and she practiced her spells until they were perfect and then practiced them again. In the old story, the one that never quite happened, this eagerness had set her apart and made her lonely. A girl too clever to be liked, weeping in a bathroom because no one wished to be her friend. But that was not this story. In this story, Hermione had never been friendless, not for a single day of her school life, because she had arrived at Hogwarts with a best friend already at her side. A boy who had loved her cleverness since they were both very small and had never once made her feel that knowing things was a fault. And so she was not lonely, and she did not weep, and there was no need for any of it. That was the great difference, and it ran quietly beneath everything, though none of the three friends thought much about it at the time. Harry, for his part, was steadier than the lonely boy he might have been. He was not carrying the whole strange weight of the magical world alone, marveling at every new thing in solitude. He had someone to marvel with, someone who explained things and looked things up and grew as excited as he did, and someone who, when the older students whispered about the famous Harry Potter, simply rolled her eyes at him in the old familiar way that reminded him he was only Harry, the boy from number 4, and always had been. Ron settled into the friendship the way a third stone settles into a wall, holding the others steady and being held in turn. He teased Hermione about her books and her endless studying, and she teased him about his complete indifference to homework, and the two of them bickered cheerfully in a way that might have curdled into real dislike between strangers, but that between friends was only the pleasant friction of people who have decided to belong to one another. Harry sat between them, amused and content, and thought sometimes, in the drowsy warmth of the common room fire, that he had somehow been given a family after all. And then came the night of the Halloween feast, when the whole school gathered in the great hall beneath 1,000 live bats and floating carved pumpkins, and the danger came into the castle. It came in the middle of the feast, a teacher running the length of the hall in terror, crying out that a mountain troll had got into the dungeons, and then fainting dead away upon the floor. Panic rippled through the tables until the old wizard restored order and sent the students back toward their towers. In the confusion of the crowds, the three friends stayed close, as they always stayed close, and it was Harry who first thought of the danger, and Hermione who first understood its shape, for the two of them had spent a childhood reading each other's faces, and they read each other now. The troll, it turned out, had not stayed in the dungeons. It had found its way up into the school, into the very corridor where the friends now stood, and it was a dreadful thing to behold. 12 feet of gray lumbering muscle, dragging an enormous wooden club along the flagstones, its small head swaying on its great shoulders and its smell rolling ahead of it like something rotten. It had blundered into a girl's bathroom, and the three friends, pressing themselves against the wall, might have fled and left it there, save that they were not the sort to flee when someone might be trapped inside. Here the old story would have turned upon a lie. In that other telling, Hermione had been alone in the bathroom, hiding and weeping, because the boys had hurt her feelings that very morning. And when the troll cornered her, and the boys came bravely to save her, and a teacher arrived to find the beast unconscious and the children among the wreckage, it had fallen to Hermione to tell a brave and generous untruth. She had taken the blame upon herself, had said that she had gone looking for the troll alone out of foolish pride, and by that lie she had shielded the boys and bought their friendship with it, and only then had the three of them truly become friends. But in this story there was no lie, because there was no need for one, because the friendship it was meant to purchase already existed and had existed for years. Hermione was not weeping alone in the bathroom. Hermione was standing shoulder to shoulder with Harry and Ron in the corridor, the three of them together, when the troll swung its great club and the danger became real. What happened next happened fast and frightening and true. The troll turned upon them, and there was a scramble and a great deal of shouting, and Hermione, thinking more clearly than either boy in the terror of the moment, called out the words of the charm they had practiced in class, and Ron, following her, made the great club rise from the troll's own grip and hang for a moment in the air and then fall back upon its owner's head. The troll swayed and toppled and lay still, and the three children stood among the ruined sinks, shaking, breathing hard, unharmed, when the teachers came running and found the fallen troll and the three white-faced first years. There was no story to invent. There was only the truth, which the friends told plainly, all three of them together, that the troll had come upon them, and they had brought it down between them. There was no blame to shoulder for a friend, no untruth to bind them, because the bond they had was older than the castle and needed no such binding. They had been friends before Hogwarts, and they would be friends after it, and a mountain troll, terrible as it was, only proved once more what the three of them already knew, that they were stronger standing together than any of them could ever be alone. They walked back to Gryffindor Tower afterward, with their knees still weak, and they said very little, and Hermione slipped her hand briefly into Harry's the way she had used to do when they were small and frightened on Privet Drive, and he squeezed it once and let it go, and Ron pretended not to notice and grinned to himself in the dark. Something had settled among the three of them that night, not the beginning of a friendship, for that had begun long before, but the deepening of it, the quiet knowledge that they would face frightening things together and come through them together again and again, for as long as the years asked it of them. Up next in Chapter 12, The Mirror and the Stone, we'll follow the friends deeper into the mysteries of the castle, past a great sleeping danger and a mirror that shows the heart's desire, toward a hidden treasure and the first true test of everything they were becoming. The rest of that first year unfolded slowly and richly, the way a long winter unfolds when a person has, at last, a warm place to spend it. There were flying lessons on the cold autumn grounds, where Harry discovered that he could ride a broomstick as though he had been born to it, and there was the roar of the crowd when he was made the youngest player on the house team in 100 years, and there was Hermione in the stands beside Ron, gripping the wooden rail and watching him streak across the sky, proud and terrified in equal measure. The three friends studied and argued and laughed their way through the term, and the castle, which had seemed so vast and strange upon that first night, became as familiar to them as their own street had once been. But there was a mystery threaded through that year, and the three of them, being curious and brave and rather too clever for their own peace, could not help but follow it. It had begun with a forbidden corridor on the 3rd floor, which they had been warned to avoid, and which they had of course not avoided, and behind a locked door there they had discovered a monstrous dog with 3 heads, standing guard over a small trapdoor in the floor. Hermione had noticed that the dog was standing upon something, for Hermione noticed everything, And from that small observation, the three of them began, patiently, over the long months, to piece together what lay hidden beneath the school. What lay hidden was a stone, an ancient and legendary thing, capable of turning any metal into gold and of making a draught that would keep a person alive forever. It had been brought to the castle for safekeeping, and it had been hidden behind a series of great enchantments, each set by a different teacher, so that no thief could reach it. And it had become clear to the three friends, as the year wore toward its end, that someone within the castle wished to steal it. Someone who served the very darkness that had shadowed Harry's whole life. The dark wizard whose name the wizarding world still feared to speak. In the old story, Harry had carried much of this dread alone. The strange feeling of being watched, the sense of a gathering danger, shared only in pieces with his friends. In this story, he carried none of it alone, for Hermione had been reading the signs beside him since they were children, and she read them now. It was Hermione, in the end, who found the answer to the greatest question, the true name of the ancient master who had made the stone, and she found it in the library, of course, in a great heavy book she had checked out weeks before, and had been carrying to her lessons ever since, waiting for the pieces to fit. When they fit, she came running to find the boys with the book open in her arms. And the three of them understood at last what they were dealing with, and understood too that they might be the only ones who did. Along the way that year, Harry had come upon a strange and wonderful thing, tucked away in a disused classroom in the depths of a winter night. It was a tall mirror in an ornate golden frame, and when a person stood before it, it did not show them their reflection, but rather the deepest and most secret longing of their heart. When Harry had stood before it, he had seen his mother and his father standing behind him, smiling, a whole family he had never known, and he had returned to it night after night, aching, unable to look away. But he had not gone alone. He had brought Hermione, because he brought Hermione to everything, and when she had stood before the glass, she had seen her own quiet wish, and the two of them had sat before the mirror together in the dark and spoken softly of longing and of loss. It was the old wizard with the silver beard who found them there at last, gentle as ever, and warned them kindly that it did not do to dwell upon dreams and forget to live, and had the mirror moved away. And Harry, who in the lonelier story had faced that mirror and its ache mostly alone, faced it here with a friend beside him, who understood exactly what it was to long for a family, because she had watched him long for one since they were both very small. When the end of the year came, and the danger sharpened, and it seemed that the theft of the stone was near, the three friends did what they had always done. They went together. They believed that the teachers would not listen in time, and so they went down through the trapdoor themselves, one after another, into the dark beneath the school, past the three-headed dog they had lulled to sleep with music, and into the series of chambers where the great enchantments waited. And each chamber, as it happened, was a chamber suited to one of them. There was a strangling plant that would have crushed them, and it was Hermione, keeping her head where the boys lost theirs, who remembered the way to drive it back with light and warmth. There was a room full of flying keys, and it was Harry, quickest and cleverest on a broom, who caught the one they needed. And there was a great chessboard where the pieces came alive and had to be played across, and it was Ron, who loved the game above all others, who directed them through it and gave himself up to the board so that his friends might pass. Each of them had a gift, and each gift was needed, and none of them could have reached the end alone. At the last, it was Harry who went on into the final chamber, because the danger there was meant for him. And it was there that he found the mirror again, and the thief, and the terrible half-life of the dark wizard himself, hidden and hungry, reaching for the stone. What passed between them in that room was frightening and strange, a struggle of will and of love. and Harry came through it burned and shaken but alive. For there was an old and deep protection upon him that the darkness could not bear to touch. When it was over, the stone was safe, and the danger was driven off for a time, and Harry was carried up out of the dark to the quiet white ward of the hospital wing, where he slept for days while the castle went on around him. And when he woke, the first faces he saw were the faces of his friends. Hermione was there, of course, having refused to be sent away, having sat by his bed with a book unread in her lap, and Ron was there beside her. And the three of them were together again, whole and safe, with the whole bright summer of the school grounds waiting beyond the windows. The old wizard came and spoke gently with Harry of what had happened, of love and of protection, and of the mother who had died to save him. And Harry listened and understood a little more of himself, and was glad beyond words that he had not had to learn any of it alone. The year ended in the great hall with a feast and a great celebration, and Gryffindor won the house cup, and the three friends sat together beneath the floating candles as they had sat on the very first night, changed now, closer now, forged now by a year of wonders and dangers survived side by side. And when the scarlet engine carried them south again toward the ordinary world, the three of them shared a compartment as they had at the beginning, and Harry and Hermione stepped off the train together onto the platform where their families waited. Two children who had left Privet Drive as friends and were returning to it as something even stronger. Up next in Chapter 13, Whispers in the Walls, we'll return to the castle for a darker and stranger year, where an old and hidden chamber stirs beneath the stones, and a fear moves quietly through the corridors, and the courage of children is tested once again. Chapter 13, Whispers in the Walls. The second year at Hogwarts came in on a strange, low tide, and if you had been walking the corridors in those first cool weeks of autumn, you might have felt it too. A faint unease running under the ordinary rhythm of the school, like water moving beneath a frozen pond. For Harry and Hermione it began, as so much of their lives had begun, with the two of them together, side by side, noticing a thing that other people had not yet learned to notice. They had grown up on the same narrow street, sharing the same silences, and so they had both become very good, from a young age, at hearing what was not quite being said. That old habit served them now, in a castle that had started, ever so quietly, to keep a secret of its own. It started with the whispers. Harry heard them first, a thin, cold, sliding voice that seemed to move through the stone itself, a voice that spoke of hunger and of tearing and of blood, and that no one else in the crowded corridor seemed able to hear at all. He went still when he heard it, the way he used to go still on Privet Drive when a door slammed too hard, and Hermione, who was walking at his elbow with an armful of books, saw the stillness before she understood the cause. She did not ask him 100 questions there in the open. She simply steered him gently by the sleeve into a quieter passage, sat him down on a cold windowsill, and waited, the way she had waited for him 1,000 times in the shelter of a hedge when they were small. Only when the color had come back into his face did she let him tell her, in a low, unsteady murmur, about the voice in the walls. Most people would have laughed, or been frightened, or told him he had imagined it. Hermione did none of those things. She had spent her whole childhood believing Harry when the world would not, and she was not about to stop now. Instead, she took out a fresh piece of parchment, smoothed it flat against her knee, and began, in her small, neat hand, to write down everything he could remember. Where he had stood, what the voice had said, the exact hour, and the day, and the strange chill that had come with it. She did not yet know what any of it meant, but she believed, with the quiet certainty that had held the two of them together for years, that a thing written down was a thing halfway to being understood. Then came the message on the wall. They found it together on a wet evening in late October, the corridor flooded to their ankles, the torches guttering, and there, upon the cold stone, daubed in a red that shone like something wet and living, were words that spoke of a chamber opened and of enemies who ought to beware. Below the message, hanging stiff and dreadful from a torch bracket, was Mrs. Norris, the caretaker's cat, not dead, but changed into something hard and gray as a statue. All around them the school was gathering, whispering, pointing, and Harry felt the old cold weight of being stared at settle onto his shoulders. But Hermione stepped a little closer to him in the crowd, so that their arms touched, and that small, steady pressure said everything that words would have spoiled. They were in this together. They had always been in everything together. Whatever the castle had woken, it had woken to find two children who would not be pulled apart. In the days that followed, fear moved through Hogwarts the way cold moves through an old house, seeping first under the doors and then into the very rooms where people lived. The Chamber of Secrets, the older students whispered, an ancient hidden place, opened once before, long ago, and opened now again. A monster, they said, that hunted those born to families without magic, those whose blood the cruel old stories called unworthy. Hermione heard those words and felt them land somewhere near her heart, for she knew that the stories meant children like her, children whose parents fixed teeth and read ordinary books and had never in their lives heard of Hogwarts. She grew quieter for a little while, thoughtful in a new and heavier way, and Harry, who knew her every silence as well as he knew his own, sat with her in the library and did not try to fill it. He only stayed. Staying, they had both learned long ago, was its own kind of answer. But Hermione was not a girl to sit inside her fear for long. She turned it, as she turned everything, into work. She read. She read in the mornings before the porridge had cooled, and in the evenings until Madame Pince all but swept her from the shelves. And slowly, patiently, she began to gather the frightened rumors of the castle into something that looked more and more like a shape. She noticed how the attacks came near water, how the pipes ran through the walls, how the strange voice Harry heard was a voice of hunting and of the hunt drawing near. She filled page after page with careful deductions, crossing out the wrong ideas, circling the ones that held, building a small, bright island of reason in the middle of a sea of dread. And when at last a great idea began to gather at the edge of her mind, an idea about the creature and about the pipes and about a book in the restricted section, she went, as she always went, to find Harry first, so that they might carry the knowing between them. The petrifications went on through that long, uneasy winter, and each one struck the school like a bell tolling in the dark. A student here, a ghost there, each one found hard and still and staring, each one carried carefully to the hospital wing to wait for a cure. The corridors emptied earlier in the evenings. Teachers walked the students to their lessons in nervous little groups. Something ancient and patient was moving through the walls of the only real home Harry had ever known, and he felt the old, helpless anger of his childhood rising in him, the feeling of a danger he could not see and could not fight. Yet he was not alone with it now. That was the thing that had changed, the thing that changed everything. On Privet Drive, he had faced his fears in a locked and silent cupboard. Here he faced them beside a friend who wrote down his nightmares in a neat round hand and refused, absolutely refused, to let him believe he was imagining things. There is a particular courage that belongs to children, and it is not the loud kind. It is the courage of two 11 and 12-year-olds sitting up late over a stolen library book, tracing a monster's path along the plumbing of a 1,000-year-old castle, frightened half to death and going on anyway, because a friend is frightened too, and must not be left alone in it. That was the courage Harry and Hermione carried through that whispering winter. They did not always understand what they found. They did not yet know how near the danger truly was, nor how close it would come to touching one of their own. But they had a thread of reason in Hermione's careful writing, and they had each other. And on the coldest nights, when the voice slid through the walls and the torches burned low, that was enough to keep the dark at arm's length for one more day. And so the castle held its breath, and the whispers went on, and two children, who had learned long ago how to keep a secret, bent their heads together over a candle and worked patiently toward the truth. Up next in Chapter 14, A Turner of Time and Too Many Hours, we'll follow Harry and Hermione into a third year at Hogwarts, where the hours themselves seem to bend, where an escaped prisoner and a great gray beast and a small golden hourglass test of friendship that has already weathered so much. And see how a bond begun on Privet Drive holds steady even when time itself is folded in two. Chapter 14, A Turner of Time and Too Many Hours. The third year began with a small golden secret hanging on a chain around Hermione's neck, though neither Harry nor anyone else knew of it yet. And if you had watched her walking the corridors that autumn, you might have wondered how one girl could possibly be in so many places at once. She was, of course. That was the heart of the strangeness of that year. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and this is a night for going slowly, so let us begin where the year began, with a train and a long quiet worry, and two friends who had grown, once again, a little taller over the summer. The worry that hung over that third year had a name, and the name moved through the wizarding world like a cold drought under a door. Sirius Black had escaped from a prison that no one was ever meant to escape, and everyone said he was coming for Harry. On the great scarlet train that carried them north, the lamps dimmed and the windows frosted over, and a creature of pure cold, a Dementor, came gliding down the corridor, drawing all the warmth and all the happiness out of the air as it came. Harry felt the old worst feelings of his life rise up to swallow him, the loneliness of the cupboard, the ache of years without a kind word, and he fell into a faint upon the floor of the compartment. When he woke, the first thing he saw was Hermione's face bent close over his, pale and frightened and steady all at once, her hand gripping his so hard it almost hurt. She had been calling his name. She did not let go until the color came back to him. She never did let go until the color came back. Because the two of them had grown up hungry and watchful, they understood cold better than most children, and they understood it in more ways than one. The Dementors that guarded the school that year, drifting at the edges of the grounds like gray rags of winter, seemed to reach for Harry more hungrily than for anyone else, as though they knew how much sorrow he carried. Hermione watched this with the quiet, fierce attention she had once given to a thin boy at number 4 Privet Drive, and she resolved, in her practical way, that Harry should not have to face the cold undefended. She could not fight the creatures herself, but she could make sure he learned to, and she could make sure he ate and rested and was not left alone with the memories the Dementors dredged up. Love, in Hermione, had always looked a great deal like usefulness. Now, about that small golden secret, Hermione had taken on more lessons that year than a single ordinary day could possibly hold. More subjects than there were hours to attend them, and she had done it in the only way that such a thing could be done. A time turner, a delicate hourglass on a fine chain, given to her by the school so that she might turn back the hours and live certain afternoons twice over. She kept it hidden beneath her robes, and she spoke of it to no one, not even to Harry, for she had given her word, and Hermione's word was a thing of iron. but the weight of it told on her all the same. She grew tired in a way that frightened her friends, worn thin by living too many hours, stretched across too much time. And Harry, who could read her weariness the way she could read his silences, watched her with a growing gentle concern, and carried her books when her arms trembled, and saved her the soft chair by the common room fire, without ever quite saying why. There is a lesson folded inside that little hourglass, and it is a lesson for a sleepy hour, so let us hold it up to the light for a moment. Hermione learned that year that a person cannot simply pile more and more hours onto herself and expect to carry them all. That even a mind as bright and hungry as hers has a limit, and that the limit is not a failure, but a kindness the body offers, a way of saying rest now. She would set the time turner aside before the year was done, gently, without regret, having learned that some things are not worth the wearing down of oneself. And she learned it, in part, because a friend who had known her since they were small kept looking at her tired eyes and quietly, without lecturing, reminding her that she was allowed to stop. The year turned, as years do, toward its strange and tangled end, and on one particular night, the hours themselves seemed to fold in two. There was a great gray creature that year, a hippogriff named Buckbeak, proud and fierce and gentle by turns, a beast that had been condemned by frightened men for the crime of being wild. Hermione had wept over the unfairness of it, for she had never in her life been able to bear a cruelty done to a creature that could not speak for itself, and that soft, ferocious mercy in her was the very same thing that had once made her slip food to a hungry boy over a garden hedge. And there was Sirius Black, who turned out to be not the monster the world had painted, but something far sadder and far more surprising, a man wronged and hunted, innocent of the crime that had caged him. On that folded night, with the moon rising and danger pressing in from every side, it was the small golden hourglass that made the difference between despair and hope. Hermione, calm even in terror, understood before anyone else what had to be done. And she and Harry turned the hours back together and lived that night twice, once forward into loss and once again into rescue. They moved through the dark grounds like two quiet shadows, careful, frightened, utterly certain of one another, saving a great gray creature and a hunted man from the hours that had already, in one telling, doomed them both. And through all of it, through the wheeling of time and the beating of their own hearts, they never let go of each other's hands. They had learned that grip long ago, in the shelter of a hedge on an ordinary street. It had held them then. It held them now, even when time itself was bent double around them. When the year finally released them, worn and wiser, into the long light of another summer, they were not the same children who had boarded the train in the autumn. They had seen that the frightening stories the world tells are not always true, that a hunted man might be gentle and a caged beast might be innocent, that fear is very often a poor and hasty judge. And they had proven, once more, the oldest truth of their whole small history together, the truth that had begun on Privet Drive and would carry them all the way to the end. A friendship steady enough will hold under any strain, even the strain of too many hours, even the folding of time. Hermione handed back the little hourglass at the end of that year and let the extra hours go, and slept, at last, a full and ordinary night. And Harry, in the room down the corridor, slept too, no longer alone with the cold, because a friend had made very sure he would not have to be. Up next in Chapter 15, A Tournament and a Quieter Courage, we'll walk with Harry and Hermione into a year of fire and champions and terrible pressure, a year when Harry's name is drawn against his will into a deadly contest, and see how the quiet, unshowy, lifelong courage of a friend at his side becomes the steadiest thing in a world suddenly full of danger. Chapter 15. A Tournament and a Quieter Courage. The fourth year came dressed in spectacle, and if you had stood in the great hall on the evening it began, you would have seen wonders enough to fill a lifetime of ordinary dreams. Two great foreign schools arrived at Hogwarts that autumn, one gliding down upon the lake in a vast ship that rose dripping from the black water, the other sweeping out of the sky in a powder-blue carriage drawn by winged horses. A tournament had been revived, an old and dangerous contest between champions, and the whole castle hummed with the excitement of it. But this is a story less about the spectacle than about the quiet courage that stood beside it, and so let us turn our eyes, as we always do, toward two friends who had grown up on the same narrow street, and who now moved through all this grandeur with their old habit of watching out for one another. The trouble arrived, as trouble so often did for Harry, without his asking for it. On the night the champions were chosen, when 3 names had already been drawn from the enchanted goblet of blue fire, a 4th name came fluttering out into the hush of the hall, and the 4th name was Harry's. He had not entered. He had not wanted any part of it. Yet there he stood, pulled once more into a danger he had not chosen, stared at by 1,000 faces, and feeling the old cold certainty that the world had singled him out again for something he did not deserve. In that terrible moment, when even his newest friends drew back in doubt and suspicion, there was one person in all the castle who did not doubt him for so much as a heartbeat. Hermione believed him at once, completely, the way she had believed him since they were small children, whispering over a hedge. She did not need to be persuaded. She had spent her whole life learning to trust the truth in Harry's face. That was the shape of her courage that year, and it was not the kind that draws a crowd. When a good part of the school turned against Harry, muttering that he was a cheat and a glory seeker, when even his oldest friendships strained and cracked under the weight of jealousy and hurt, Hermione simply stayed. She walked beside him to every meal, though the whispers followed them. She sat with him in the library through the long, anxious evenings, helping him prepare for tasks that might well kill him, and she did not once let him see how frightened she was, because she understood that her fear would only add to his. There is a certain bravery in being the steady one, in swallowing your own terror so that someone you love may borrow your calm. Hermione had been practicing that bravery since she was 7 years old, and slipping food to a hungry boy next door, and now, in a castle full of champions, it was the truest heroism the year would offer. The tasks themselves were fearsome things, and each one pressed down on Harry like a great stone. First, there was a dragon, an enormous horned beast that guarded a golden egg with fire and fury. And in the weeks before it, Hermione worked herself half to exhaustion at his side, drilling him in charm after charm out in a cold clearing at the edge of the grounds, until the movements were sure in his hands and the words came without thinking. When at last he faced the dragon and came through it alive, the first face he looked for in the roaring crowd was hers, and the first thing she did was fling her arms around him so hard the breath went out of them both, half laughing and half crying, the way she had once run to him across a garden when he had leapt impossibly onto a roof. Some things about the two of them never changed, however tall they grew. The second task took Harry down into the black cold water of the lake, and here the story bends in a way that shows plainly how deep their bond had grown. For it was Hermione herself, or the thought of her, whom the tournament's makers judged precious enough to place at the bottom of that lake for a champion to save. She was bound there in an enchanted sleep among the weeds and the dark, and when Harry came for her, swimming down and down through the freezing water past all sense and all safety, he came with the single stubborn certainty that had ruled his heart since childhood. He would not leave her behind. he would not leave any of them behind. But her least of all, for she was the oldest home he had, the first person on that cruel ordinary street who had ever looked at him and seen a friend. He brought her up into the light, and she woke gasping in his arms. And though the judges fussed about points and rules, the two of them knew that something far older and far realer than any tournament had just been proven once again beneath the water. Between the great dangers there were smaller trials too, the ordinary aches of growing up, and Hermione met those with the same quiet steadiness. There was a night of music and dancing, a great winter ball, and Hermione walked down the stairs transformed, and for a moment the whole hall turned to look. But what mattered to the story of the two of them was not the dress or the dancing. It was that later, when the evening turned sad, as festive evenings sometimes do, when hurt feelings and clumsy words left her crying alone on a cold stone stair, it was the old friendship that remembered how to be gentle. Harry, who had never in his life been good with words, did the thing he had always done best, which was simply to sit down beside her in the quiet and stay, so that she would not have to be sad alone. They had taught each other that trick long ago. It still worked. The year drew toward its end in shadow, for the tournament hid a darkness at its center, and the final task would open a door that could not afterward be closed. There would be grief before the summer came, a real and terrible grief, the first great loss to touch their small circle, and the world would tilt into something harder and more frightening than the children of Privet Drive had ever known. But that belongs to the chapters ahead. For tonight, let us hold the year at its gentlest truth, which is this: through all the fire and the spectacle, through dragons and dark water and the cruel whispering of a crowd, the steadiest and bravest thing in Harry's whole 4th year was not a spell or a trophy or a champion's daring. It was a friend who had known him since they were small, who believed him when others would not, who swallowed her own fear to lend him her calm, and who never once, in all that dangerous year, let him feel that he was facing any of it alone. That is the quieter courage, the kind the tournament had no prize for. It was the kind Hermione had carried all along. Up next, in Chapter 16, an army in a hidden room will gather with Harry and Hermione in a secret chamber deep within the castle, where a frightened school learns to defend itself, where Harry becomes a teacher and Hermione the quiet heart that holds it all together, and see how a handful of friends grows into something very much like an army. Chapter 16, an army in a hidden room. The 5th year settled over Hogwarts like a gray blanket, heavy and stifling, and it was a harder year than any that had come before, though its hardness was of a quiet, wearing kind rather than a loud one. A new authority had come to the castle, cold and smiling and cruel in the way that only small-minded power can be, and one by one the freedoms of the school were taken away. The truth was being denied in high places. A great darkness had returned to the world, and those who ought to have sounded the alarm chose instead to pretend that all was well, and to punish anyone who dared to say otherwise. Harry knew the darkness was real. He had seen it with his own eyes, and for telling the truth he was mocked and disbelieved, called a liar by the very people meant to keep the children safe. For a boy who had grown up being disbelieved, who had spent his childhood in a house where his every honest word was treated as a fault, this was a particular kind of misery, and it pressed on Harry all through that long autumn. But he was not the frightened child of the cupboard anymore, and this time he was not alone in his knowing. Beside him, as she had been beside him since they were small on Privet Drive, stood Hermione, and where Harry saw only unfairness and felt only anger, Hermione, in her steady, practical way, began to see a plan. If the school would not be taught how to defend itself, then they would simply have to teach one another. If the grown-ups had failed them, then the children would have to look after their own. It was, when you thought about it, the oldest lesson of her whole life. She had learned it at 7, slipping food over a hedge to a hungry boy whom no grown-up would help. Now, she would teach it to a whole frightened school. The idea was hers from the very beginning, and it was a brave one, far braver than it looked. She proposed that a group of students meet in secret, in defiance of every new rule, to learn real defensive magic from the one person among them who truly knew it. That person, of course, was Harry. He had faced the darkness and lived, again and again, and though he never thought of himself as anyone special, Hermione saw plainly what he could not. She saw that all those years of danger had made him, without his ever meaning it, into someone worth following. So she gathered the willing, and she organized the meetings, and she thought of every careful detail, from the enchanted coins that would carry word of when to gather to the quiet oath that would keep them all safe from betrayal. Harry brought the knowledge and the heart. Hermione brought the order and the plan. Between the two of them, as always, the thing was carried whole. They needed a place to meet, a place hidden from cruel eyes, and the castle itself, ancient and kind in its strange way, gave them one. High in a quiet corridor there was a room that appeared only to those who truly needed it, shaping itself to whatever its finders required. When Harry walked past its blank stretch of wall 3 times, thinking hard of a place to learn and to be safe, a door grew out of the stone, and beyond it lay a warm chamber lined with cushions and books and every instrument they might need to practice by. The Room of Requirement, the old stories called it, and it seemed to Hermione, when she first stepped inside, that the room understood something the whole cold official world had forgotten. It understood that frightened children looking after one another was a thing worth building a room for. And so, through the darkest months of that hard year, a small light burned in secret at the heart of Hogwarts. Evening after evening, they slipped away in 1s and 2s, careful and quiet, and gathered in the hidden room to learn. Harry taught them, and it changed him to do it. The boy who had always thought himself ordinary, always half expected to be found out as nothing special, watched younger students master a spell under his patient guidance, and felt, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he was good for something more than merely surviving. Hermione watched that change come over him with a quiet, private joy, for she had known all along what he was worth. And there is a deep, sweet gladness in seeing someone you have always believed in finally begin to believe in himself. She had spent years being the only one who saw the best in him. Now a whole room full of children was learning to see it too. The room was full of friends both old and new, and it became, over those long secret weeks, something warmer than a class, and something braver than a club. There was the red-haired boy who had shared their very first train compartment, loyal and quick to laugh. There was a dreamy, fair-haired girl who saw the world sideways and was kinder than almost anyone. There was a round-faced boy who had always thought himself clumsy and useless, and who blossomed in that room into someone steady and quietly fierce. One by one, meeting by meeting, the frightened students grew surer of themselves, straighter in the shoulders, calmer in the face of the fear that hung over the whole world outside. They were becoming, without quite meaning to, something like an army. Not an army of anger, an army of friends who had decided that they would not simply wait, helpless, to be looked after by grown-ups who had already let them down. There is something in all of this worth holding on to as the night grows late, for it is the very heart of the whole long story of Harry and Hermione. Everything they built in that hidden room was built out of the same small thing they had built on Privet Drive so many years before. 2 lonely children on a cruel street had once decided to look after one another because no one else would, And that single quiet decision had grown, over the years, into a friendship, and then into a trio, and now into a whole room full of brave young people learning to stand together against the dark. Nothing about it was loud. Nothing about it was grand. It was only kindness, multiplied and multiplied again, until it looked, at last, a great deal like courage. Of course, the secret could not last forever, and before that hard year ended, the hidden room would be discovered, and the little army scattered. But nothing that truly mattered was lost, for the thing they had learned in that room could not be taken from them. They had learned that they could rely on one another. They had learned that the young are not as helpless as the frightened old world likes to pretend. And they had learned it from a boy who taught out of love and a girl who organized out of love. Two friends who had understood, since they were very small, that the surest way to survive a cold world is to refuse, absolutely, to face it alone. The lamps in the room of requirement would go dark for a time. But the courage they had kindled there would not, and in the harder years still to come, when the war stopped being a secret and became a thing of open battle, that courage would be needed more than any of them yet knew. Up next, in Chapter 17, The Hall of Prophecy, we'll follow Harry and Hermione out of the safety of the hidden room and into the shadowed depths of the ministry itself, where a battle in the dark brings the war truly home to them at last, where the first real losses fall, and where the friends who grew up side by side must stand together against a danger far greater than any they have faced before. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes over a school in its 5th year, when the children who once tumbled through the corridors have grown tall and careful, and the shadows in the world beyond the castle have begun to lengthen. In this 5th year, the dark that Harry and Hermione had known only as a rumor became something closer, something with a shape, and the two of them, who had first found one another in the narrow gap between two ordinary gardens on Privet Drive, learned that the safety of childhood does not last forever, and that the friends who last are the ones who choose to stay. It began, as so many terrible things do, with a dream that was not quite a dream. Harry had been troubled for months by visions that slipped into his sleep like water under a door, and in one of them he saw a long room, dim and vast, filled from floor to ceiling with rows upon rows of small glass spheres, each one glowing faintly with its own pale light. In the vision, someone he loved lay on the cold floor of that room, hurt and frightened, and a cruel voice pressed him to reach for one particular sphere among the thousands. Harry woke certain that Sirius, his godfather, the one grown man who had ever offered him something like a father's warmth, was in danger in that shadowed hall. Hermione, who had spent years learning to weigh Harry's certainties against the facts, listened to him with the steady patience she had carried since they were small children whispering under a hedge. She did not dismiss the fear, for she had never once dismissed him, but neither did she let it run wild. She reminded him, gently, that the mind can be deceived, that the very enemy who haunted his dreams might wish him to believe exactly this, and that there were quieter ways to learn the truth before rushing headlong into the dark. She was right, as she so often was, and yet the fear was too large and too old to be reasoned away, and in the end, the need to know was greater than the caution she offered. So it was that a small band of them set out that night for the great ministry of magic, hidden deep beneath the streets of London, the same grey city where the two of them had grown up only a few miles apart. They traveled together, Harry and Hermione and Ron, and with them Neville and Luna and Ginny, 6 young people bound by the room they had built in secret and the lessons they had shared there. They descended through the cold machinery of the ministry, down and down, until at last they came to the door that Harry had seen in his sleep. and beyond it lay the Hall of Prophecy, exactly as the dream had promised, endless and blue-lit and silent. The rows of glass spheres stretched away into darkness, and the air among them felt thick, as though the whole room were holding its breath. They walked slowly between the towering shelves, reading the faded labels, searching for the one that bore Harry's name. And the deeper they went, the more plainly it became clear that Sirius was not there at all. There was no one hurt upon the floor, no godfather in need of rescue, only the cold and the glass and the growing certainty that they had been led into a trap laid with terrible care. Hermione understood it first, as she had understood the troll and the basilisk and so many dangers before, and the knowledge settled over the six of them like a shadow. Then the darkness moved. Out of the spaces between the shelves came the cloaked and masked servants of the enemy, the Death Eaters, gliding forward with wands raised, and the quiet hall became a place of running and shouting and light. Harry, who had carried the weight of prophecy and hunted childhood alone for so long, was not alone now. Beside him ran the friends he had gathered, and among them, always, the girl from 3 doors down, who had taught him to read in the little library of Little Whinging, and had never once let him face the worst of things by himself. They fought their way through the shattering glass, spells flashing green and red in the dimness, and for all their youth they fought well, because they had trained together and trusted one another completely. Yet they were children still, and their enemies were grown and cruel and many. In the chaos of the retreat, Hermione was struck by a curse in the dark, a silent flash of light across her chest, and she fell without a sound. In that moment, Harry felt the ground of his whole life tilt beneath him, for she was the first friend he had ever had, the constant of every year since the hedge, and the thought that he might lose her was a cold he had no name for. She lived. The curse had been a grievous one, and for long minutes he did not know it, carrying the fear like a stone. But she breathed, and later she healed, and the bond that had begun on Privet Drive did not break that night. Others were less fortunate. In the deepest chamber of the ministry, where an ancient stone archway stood veiled and murmuring, the battle reached its bitter height, and Sirius Black, who had come after all to save the godson he loved, fell through that veil and did not come back. Harry's grief in that moment was vast and wordless, and it was Hermione, wounded as she was, who understood without being told that some losses cannot be argued with, only borne. They came home to the castle changed. The war they had half believed in was real now, confirmed at last before the whole of the wizarding world, and the childhood that had sheltered them was ending. Yet even in the grief of that homecoming there was a quiet mercy, and it was the same mercy that had followed the two of them since they were small and lonely on an unkind street. Neither of them was alone. Harry had a friend who had chosen him before either of them knew what they were, and Hermione had a friend she had chosen in return, and between them ran a loyalty older than magic itself. In the days that followed, as the summer came on and the castle emptied, they sat together in the quiet, the way they had once sat in the shelter of the hedge, saying little, needing to say little. Hermione, recovering slowly, turned her sharp and tender mind toward what must come next, for she had always been the one to look ahead, to prepare, to gather what would be needed for the road. Harry, hollowed by loss, found in her steadiness the same shelter he had found in her since they were 11 years old, and frightened on the same railway platform. The dark had pressed in at last, and it had cost them dearly, but it had not taken the thing that mattered most, which was the friendship that had begun in a gap between two gardens, and had grown, year by quiet year, into something strong enough to stand against the coming night. Up next in Chapter 18, three friends, a tent, and the cold, will follow Harry and Hermione and Ron out of the castle altogether into a long and lonely wandering across a gray and wintry land where three young people carry an impossible burden between them, and the bond first knotted on Privet Drive is tested by hunger and fear and the slow ache of a war that has no clear end. There comes a time in every long story when the walls fall away, when the familiar rooms and the safe corridors are left behind, and the ones who must carry the heaviest burden find themselves out under an open and indifferent sky. For Harry and Hermione and Ron, that time came in the year the castle could no longer keep them, when the war had spread its cold across the whole of the country, and there was no longer any safe place to sleep. They took to the road with little more than a tent and each other, and in the long wandering that followed, the friendship that had first taken root in the gap between two gardens on Privet Drive was stretched thinner than it had ever been, and yet it did not break. They were three now, and had been three for years, but the heart of it had always been the two who grew up on the same gray street. Hermione had prepared for this exile with the same quiet thoroughness she had once brought to a library card and a stack of borrowed books. In a small beaded bag no larger than her hand, charmed to hold far more than it could reasonably contain, she had packed everything she could imagine they might need, from spare clothes and healing draughts to a whole traveling library of worn and precious books. She had thought ahead, as she always did, because thinking ahead was how a lonely child from Little Whinging had learned to keep herself and the people she loved safe. Their task was a strange and terrible one. Somewhere in the world were hidden fragments of the enemy's own soul, dark and secret things, each one anchoring him to life, and until every fragment was found and destroyed, the war could never truly end. Harry carried the burden of that quest the way he had once carried the burden of being the odd boy at number 4, silently and without complaint, and Hermione carried it beside him, unraveling clues, poring over old books by wandlight, turning the whole immense problem over and over in her careful mind. They did not always know where to go. More often than not, they knew nothing at all, and simply moved on, pitching the tent in one lonely place after another, in windswept moors and dripping forests and the shelter of cold hillsides. The tent became their whole small world. By day, they took turns keeping watch, one of them always sitting at the flap, with a wand across the knees, staring out at the empty land while the others tried to rest. By night, the three of them huddled close against the chill, listening to the wind and to the wireless that brought them fragments of terrible news from far away. It was a hard, thin life, and it wore at them all. There was never enough food, and the hunger gnawed at their tempers, and the fear of being found sat with them, always like an unwelcome fourth companion at the fire. There was a season in that wandering when the cold got into more than their bones. A dark object they were forced to carry, one of the very fragments they sought, seemed to press upon whoever wore it, drawing out the worst of their fears and resentments, and it worked most cruelly upon Ron. In the worst of the winter, worn down and frightened and sick with the weight of it, he quarreled bitterly and left them, walking out into the dark and not coming back. Harry felt the loss keenly, but it was Hermione who wept, for she had loved Ron in the quiet way she loved all the people she had chosen, and his going tore at her. And so, for a long stretch of that gray year, the wandering came down at last to the two of them, exactly the two who had begun it all beneath a suburban hedge so many years before. Harry and Hermione, alone together against a whole dark world, moving the tent from place to place, keeping watch for one another through the long nights, sharing what little food there was. There was something in that hard solitude that echoed the very beginning of things, when they had been two odd and lonely children on an ordinary street, each convinced they were the only strange one in all the world. Until they found each other in the gap between the gardens and were never quite so alone again. Hermione did not let him fall. On the coldest and most hopeless of nights, when Harry sat hollow-eyed and empty, half convinced that the quest was impossible and the war already lost, she would open one of her worn books by the light of her wand and read in silence, searching, always searching, for the thread that would lead them onward. She was tired and thin and frightened, but she did not stop, because stopping was not in her, and because the boy across the tent was the first friend she had ever had, and she would not abandon him to the dark. They talked sometimes of Privet Drive, of the little library with its warm lamps, of the hedge and the whispered secrets and the strange things they could not explain, and those memories were a small fire they kept between them against the cold. In time, Ron came back to them, sorry and changed, having fought his way through his own darkness to return, and Hermione's forgiveness, when at last it came, was the deeper for the hurt that had preceded it. The three were three again, and stronger for having nearly been broken, and together they took up the burden once more. Yet Harry never forgot the long stretch when it had come down to just the two of them, and neither did she, for it had shown them both that the thing they had built as children was the strongest thing either of them owned, stronger than fear, stronger than hunger, strong enough to hold when everything else fell away. Slowly, painfully, the quest went forward. They followed old clues into dangerous places, slipped through wards and traps, made terrible mistakes and narrow escapes, and one by one, the hidden fragments of the enemy's soul began to fall. It was slow work and lonely work, and there were nights when the end seemed impossibly far. But the friends did not turn back. They had come too far together, from a narrow street in Little Whinging to the wild and open dark of a country at war, and the road behind them was paved with too many quiet loyalties to abandon now. As that long year turned toward its close, the three of them felt the whole story beginning to gather itself, the way a river gathers before a fall. The wandering could not last forever. All the threads they had followed across the cold and empty land were pulling them, at last, back toward the one place where so much of their lives had happened, the castle that had first taken them in as frightened children and had never truly let them go. They did not yet know all that waited there, only that the time of hiding was ending, and that whatever came would come to the two who had grown up side by side, together, as they had faced everything since the hedge. Up next, in Chapter 19, The Castle That Would Not Fall, we'll return with them to Hogwarts one final time, to the halls and towers they had loved since childhood, for the last great battle of the war, where courage and grief stand side by side, and the friendship that began on Privet Drive is asked to give everything it has. Every long road bends at last toward home, and for Harry and Hermione the road they had walked since childhood bent back, in the end, to the castle that had first opened its great doors to two frightened children from an ordinary street. They came to Hogwarts one final time, not as students, but as soldiers, worn thin by their long wandering, carrying the last hopes of a whole world between them, and the night that followed was the longest and the darkest either of them had ever known. Yet it was also, in its way, the night on which the friendship first nodded beneath a suburban hedge showed the full measure of what it had become. They arrived to find the school already turning to face the storm. Word had spread that the war would end here, at Hogwarts, and from every corner of the wizarding world the defenders came, teachers and former students and friends they had not seen in months, gathering in the great stone halls to make their stand. The enemy was coming, and everyone within the walls knew it, and there was in the air that strange, still solemnity that settles over people who have decided to be brave together. Harry moved through it all with a quiet purpose, for he still had a task to finish, the last of the hidden fragments to find and destroy. And Hermione moved beside him as she always had, her sharp mind bent to the problem even now, even here. While the older ones prepared the castle's defenses, raising shimmering shields over the ancient towers and marshalling the frightened younger students to safety, Harry and Hermione and Ron slipped through the secret ways of the school on their own desperate errand. They knew those passages well, for they had grown up in this castle, had crept through its corridors in every one of their childhood years, and now that long familiarity became a weapon in itself. Hermione led them unerringly toward the places where the last dark fragments might be hidden, drawing on everything she had ever read, every clue they had ever gathered, and in the deep and dangerous heart of the school, they found what they sought and destroyed it, at terrible cost and with terrible courage. Then, the battle broke over them like a wave. The enemy's forces struck the castle in the dark, and the shields blazed and cracked, and the night filled with fire and falling stone and the flash of 1,000 spells. Through it all, the two who had grown up together on Privet Drive fought side by side, exactly as they had faced every danger since they were 11, the troll and the basilisk and the Hall of Prophecy. Only now the danger was vast beyond anything they had known, and the walls of the beloved castle shook around them. Hermione fought with a fierce and steady calm, her wand quick and sure, protecting the younger ones, holding the line. Never far from the boy she had befriended in the gap between two gardens so long ago. There was grief in that night, more grief than either of them had ever had to hold at once. Friends fell in the dark, brave and good people, who had stood with them through all the years, and there was no time to mourn them, only to fight on and carry the loss like a stone that grew heavier with every hour. Hermione wept for the fallen even as she fought, and Harry felt each loss land upon him like a blow. And yet neither of them faltered, because faltering would have meant the end of everything they had fought so long to protect. They held to one another through the worst of it, as they had held to one another through every winter of their childhood, and the holding was what kept them standing. There came a moment, deep in that terrible night, when Harry understood that the last and hardest part of the task fell to him alone, that he must walk out into the dark to meet the enemy himself, and that no friend could follow him there. It was the loneliest walk of his whole life, and yet he did not truly make it alone, for he carried with him the memory of every hand that had ever reached for his. And first and deepest among those memories was the girl who had found him watchful and unhappy at number 4, and had decided, without being asked, to be his friend. What he had to do he did, and out of the deepest darkness he came back, and the tide of the battle turned. When the fighting reached its final height, in the great entrance hall where they had first walked as awestruck children, Hermione stood among the defenders and fought with everything she had. She had grown from a bookish, lonely little girl on an unkind street into one of the bravest people in that hall. And everyone who fought beside her felt the steadiness of her, the clear and unbreakable resolve that had carried her and the boy she loved through every trial since the hedge. The enemy's power broke at last, in the gray light before dawn, and the dark that had pressed upon them for so long lifted and was gone, and the castle that would not fall stood battered but unbroken against the coming morning. In the long hours of that fighting, Hermione was everywhere she was needed. She mended the wounded where she could, conjured shelter for the frightened, and turned her clear mind again and again to the small, urgent problems that decide a battle. A barred door, a failing shield, a corridor that had to be held. She had learned, across all their years together, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it, and she made that choice 100 times over in the smoke and the dark. The other defenders came to look for her in the worst moments, drawn to the steadiness of her, and she did not fail them, for she had spent a lifetime learning how to be brave for the sake of someone she loved. Harry, wherever the battle carried him, always knew that she was somewhere in the castle fighting on, and the knowledge steadied him the way it had steadied him since they were small. The silence that followed the battle was unlike any silence they had ever known. It was heavy with grief and light with an exhausted, disbelieving relief. And through it the survivors moved slowly, finding one another, counting the living and mourning the dead. Harry and Hermione found each other, as they always did, and stood together in the ruined hall as the sun came up over the grounds they had loved since childhood. There were no words that could hold everything they felt, and so they said little, only stood close, the way they had stood in the shelter of the hedge when they were small. Two who had come impossibly far, and had, against every odd, survived it together. They thought, in that gray and golden dawn, of the long road behind them. They thought of the little library in Little Whinging with its warm lamps, of the gap between two gardens where a friendship had begun, of the letters that had come on the same bright morning, of the scarlet train and the sorting and all the years between. Everything they were had grown from those small beginnings on an ordinary street. Two lonely children who had found each other and, in finding each other, had found the strength to face a whole world of darkness and come through it into the light. The war was over. The dark had fallen, and the friendship that had begun on Privet Drive had held through everything to the very end. Up next in Chapter 20, The Street Where It Began, we'll travel forward through the long and peaceful years that followed, all the way to a quiet morning on the ordinary street where two lonely children once met, to see what became of them when the danger was finally past and there was, at last, nothing left to do but rest. And so, at the very end of the long story, the road that had wound through castles and forests and battles turned gently homeward one last time, back to the ordinary street where all of it had quietly begun. 19 years had passed since the dark had fallen. 19 slow and healing years, and the two lonely children who had once found one another in the gap between two suburban gardens had grown into adults now, settled and steady and at peace, carrying between them the whole weight of everything they had lived through, and, more precious still, everything they had kept. Time had been kind to them, in the way that time is kind to those who have earned their rest. The frightened boy from number 4 and the bookish girl from 3 doors down had grown up, and the world they had helped to save had learned, slowly, to be gentle again. The great fear was long gone, folded away into history and into the pages of the very books Hermione had always loved. Children were being born who would never know that dark, who would hear of it only as a story told softly at bedtime, and there was no gift the survivors could have wished for more than that the ones who came after them might sleep untroubled beneath a peaceful sky. Hermione had grown into everything the lonely little girl in the library had promised she might become. The mind that had once devoured every book in Little Whinging had turned itself, in the years of peace, toward mending the world, toward making it kinder and fairer and more just, and she went about that great work with the same quiet, patient thoroughness she had brought to a stack of borrowed books when she was small. She had a family of her own now, and a home full of warmth and light and, of course, of books, and she was happy in the deep and settled way of someone who has come at last to exactly where she was meant to be. Harry, too, had found the thing that had been missing from the cold house at number 4, the thing he had first glimpsed in the friendship of a girl who refused to let him be alone. He had a family that loved him, a home that was truly his. a life full of the ordinary tendernesses he had once watched other children enjoy from the far side of a garden hedge. The watchful, unhappy boy had become a gentle and steady man, and if he still carried the memory of harder years, he carried it lightly now, the way one carries an old scar that no longer aches, only reminds. And through all those 19 years, the friendship that had begun on Privet Drive had never once let go. It had changed and deepened the way friendships do across a lifetime, but its heart remained exactly what it had always been, the simple and unbreakable loyalty of two people who had chosen one another before either of them understood what choosing meant. They saw each other often, and their families were woven together, and there was between them still the easy quiet of two who had grown up side by side and needed no words to understand one another. The gap between two gardens had become a bond that spanned a whole life. In the quiet years, the two of them had often spoken of the old days, sitting together in the warm evenings while their children played, remembering how it had all begun. They remembered the little library in Little Whinging, with its soft lamps and its long shelves, the first place either of them had ever felt truly safe, and how a bookish girl had once shown a hungry, watchful boy that there were whole worlds waiting to be found among the pages. They remembered the cold winter of small kindnesses, the food slipped across a garden fence, the whispered secrets in the shelter of a hedge. Those memories had softened with time into something gentle and golden, a treasure the two of them shared and no one else could quite understand. The private history of two children who had saved one another long before either of them had ever heard of magic. On the particular bright morning at the end of the story, they came back together to the place where it had all begun. There was a great station in London, vast and echoing, from which the scarlet train still ran north to the castle every autumn, and it was there, on a crowded platform, full of steam and laughter and the bustle of families, that the two of them stood once more, side by side. For now, it was their own children who were setting off, small and excited and a little frightened, to begin their own years at the school that had shaped their parents so completely. Harry and Hermione watched them go with hearts full to overflowing, remembering another platform, another autumn. Two lonely 11-year-olds who had boarded the same train and found, in a shared compartment, the beginning of everything. Later, when the train had gone and the steam had cleared, they walked together, as they sometimes did, back to the ordinary street in Little Whinging, where the whole long story had started. Privet Drive was unchanged, neat and quiet and unremarkable. The same trimmed hedges, the same tidy gardens, the same small houses standing in their rows beneath the same wide sky. They stood for a while before number 4, and beside the house where the Grangers had lived, and looked at the narrow gap between the gardens, where two lonely children had once whispered their secrets and shared their books, and discovered that they were not, after all, alone in the world. It seemed a small thing, that gap, that ordinary stretch of grass and hedge on an ordinary suburban street, and yet everything had grown from it. Every quiet kindness, every shared adventure, every act of courage across all the years had its root in that one improbable meeting, when a bookish girl had noticed a watchful boy and had decided, simply and without fanfare, to be his friend. The whole vast story, the letters and the train, the castle and the sorting, the troll and the mirror and the long dark years of the war, all of it had flowered from that first small seed of friendship planted between two gardens on Privet Drive. They did not say very much, standing there in the soft light of that peaceful morning. They had never needed many words, and they needed even fewer now. They only stood together and remembered, and let the long story settle gently into place behind them, complete at last, a story that had carried two lonely children through darkness and out into the light, and had asked of them everything, and had given them, in the end, far more than it had ever taken. The danger was over. The dark was long gone. There was nothing left now but the quiet of an ordinary street, and the peace of a life well and bravely lived, and the deep, warm rest that comes when a story has reached its rightful end. So we leave them there, on the street where it began, two friends grown old enough to be at peace, standing side by side in the gentle morning as they had stood side by side through all the years. The books are closed, the train has gone, the castle stands quiet and safe upon its hill, and somewhere in the soft hush of that ordinary street, in the space between two gardens where a friendship once began, there is nothing left to fear and nothing left to do. Only the calm of a story ended well, and the slow, sweet drift towards sleep. Rest now. All is quiet. All is safe. And the long story, like the night, folds gently closed around you. And so, we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight, we followed a new family on a tidy street, and the quiet boy in the cupboard next door. Two lonely children meeting in the gap of a hedge, and the strange things that neither of them could explain. We sat with them in a warm library on cold afternoons, through a winter of small kindnesses, and we watched two letters arrive on the same bright morning, and Diagon Alley seen for the first time, side by side. We rode the scarlet engine and shared a compartment, waited under a hat that paused a long time, faced a mountain troll with no need for a lie, and passed through the year of the mirror and the stone. We heard whispers in the walls and turned too many hours with a turner of time, found a quieter courage in a year of tournaments, gathered an army in a hidden room, stood in the hall of prophecy, and walked into the long cold with a tent and two trusted friends, until the castle stood, and the dark fell away. And they came home at last to the street where it all began. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those bright and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.